When Lucas Hale laughed at the dusty woman standing at his gate, he had no idea she'd be carrying his child within the year, or that refusing to leave would save them both. If you're drawn to stories of unlikely love forged in the unforgiving American West, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The wind that October morning carried the smell of sagebrush and coming snow, and Lucas Hale tasted both as he rode the fence line on the northern edge of his property. The Wyoming Territory stretched out before him in waves of gold and brown, endless and empty, exactly the way he preferred it. He'd bought this land with war pay and silence, built his ranch with his own hands, and kept company with no one but his horse and the occasional coyote chorus at night. That was how he wanted it. That was how it needed to stay. So when he crested the low hill above his homestead and saw the figure trudging up the dirt road toward his gate, he felt his jaw tighten with irritation before he even registered that it was a woman. She was small, or maybe just made small by distance and exhaustion. Her dress was the color of dust, and she dragged behind her what looked like a carpet bag with one handle missing, the fabric torn and flapping in the wind. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, like someone pushing through deep water. Lucas reined his horse to a stop and watched her for a long moment, waiting for her to veer off toward the main road, to realize she'd wandered onto private land. She didn't veer off. She kept coming. Lucas clicked his tongue and urged his horse down the slope, covering the distance in a few long minutes. By the time he reached the fence, she'd made it to the gate and stopped there, one hand resting on the weathered wood post. Up close, he could see the grime on her face, the way her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in dull brown tangles around her shoulders. Her boots were cracked and worn clean through at the toe. She looked up at him without fear, without pleading. Just looked. "You lost?" Lucas asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "No," she said simply. Her voice was quiet but steady, like stones settling. He waited for more. She didn't offer it. "This is private property," he said. "I know." Lucas let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. "Then you know you're trespassing." "I need water," she said. Not a question, not a demand, just a statement of fact. He looked her over again, the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the way her dress hung loose at the waist, the strange calm in her eyes. She wasn't trying to charm him or bargain. She wasn't crying or wringing her hands. She just stood there like she had every right to be exactly where she was. "There's a creek a mile south," Lucas said, nodding back the way he'd come. "Follows the road into town." "I've been walking for 3 weeks," she said. "I can't make another mile right now." Something in the way she said it, not pleading, not dramatic, just honest, made Lucas hesitate. He told himself it was because he didn't want a dead woman on his conscience. That was all. Nothing more than that. "Fine," he said, swinging down from the saddle. "You can fill your canteen at the pump by the barn. Then you move on." She nodded once, a small dip of her chin, and stepped aside so he could unlatch the gate. He led his horse through, and she followed without a word, dragging that broken bag behind her like it carried something more valuable than the frayed clothes it probably held. The ranch yard was modest, a low cabin built from rough-cut timber, a barn that leaned slightly to the west, a chicken coop, and a corral that held 2 horses and a mule. Everything was functional, nothing decorative. Lucas had built it that way on purpose. No wasted effort, no wasted space. He tied his horse to the post near the barn and gestured toward the pump. "Help yourself." She set the bag down carefully, like it might break, and walked to the pump. Her movements were slow but sure. She worked the handle twice, 3 times, and water gushed out into the trough below. She cupped her hands beneath the flow and drank deeply, water running down her chin and soaking the collar of her dress. When she finally straightened, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at him again. "Thank you," she said. Lucas nodded, already turning back toward the cabin. "You got what you needed. Gate's that way." "Could I rest here for an hour?" she asked. He stopped mid-step and turned slowly. "What?" "Just an hour," she said. "I won't bother you. I'll sit in the shade by the barn. Then I'll go." "Lady..." My name's Clara, she said. Clara Whitfield. Lucas stared at her. She stared back. The wind picked up and sent a scatter of dry leaves skittering across the dirt between them. I don't take in strays, Lucas said flatly. I'm not asking you to take me in, Clara said. I'm asking for an hour of shade. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just that same steady certainty, like she was negotiating the price of grain at a market stall. Lucas felt something shift in his chest. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of exhausted recognition. He'd walked roads like hers before. Different reasons, same dust. 1 hour, he said. Then you're gone. Clara nodded. 1 hour. She picked up her bag and carried it to the side of the barn where the shadow was deepest, settled herself against the wall, and closed her eyes. Lucas stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked into the cabin, shutting the door harder than necessary behind him. He told himself she'd be gone when he came back out. Told himself she was just another drifter, another lost soul chasing something she'd never find. He made coffee on the stove, drank it black and bitter, and sat at the table with his back to the window. An hour passed, then 2. When Lucas finally stepped outside again, the sun had shifted low enough to stretch long shadows across the yard. Clara Whitfield was still there, but she wasn't resting anymore. She was crouched beside the chicken coop, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, re-nailing a board that had come loose from the frame. The hammer in her hand was his. He'd left it on the workbench just inside the barn door. "What the hell are you doing?" Lucas called out. Clara glanced up, then back down at the board. "Your chickens are getting out through this gap. You'll lose them to foxes if you don't fix it. I didn't ask you to—" "I know," she said, driving another nail home with 3 clean strikes. "But it needed doing." Lucas walked over and stood above her, arms crossed. "I said 1 hour." "It's been 2, Clara said, setting the hammer down and standing. She met his eyes without flinching. "I know. I'm sorry. I'll go now." She wiped her hands on her skirt and started toward her bag. Lucas watched her, his irritation tangling with something he couldn't quite name. She moved like someone who'd worked her whole life, like someone who couldn't sit still even when she was half dead from exhaustion. "Where are you headed?" he asked before he could stop himself. Clara paused, one hand on the strap of her bag. "I don't know yet." "You don't know?" "No." "You walked 3 weeks from Kansas without knowing where you're going?" "I knew I was going west," Clara said. That was enough. Lucas shook his head slowly. "You're going to die out here." "Maybe," she said, "but not today." There was no bravado in it, no false courage, just another statement of fact. Lucas looked at her, really looked, and saw the kind of stubbornness that didn't come from pride. It came from necessity, from survival. "You can sleep in the barn tonight," he heard himself say. "There's hay in the loft. It's clean. You leave at first light." Claire's expression didn't change, but something in her posture softened just slightly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Lucas said. "Just don't steal anything." The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I won't." He turned and walked back to the cabin without another word, telling himself it was just 1 night. 1 night, and then she'd be gone, and his life would go back to the way it was supposed to be. But when dawn came, Clara Whitfield was still there. But Lucas woke to the sound of someone chopping wood. He sat up in bed, disoriented for a moment, then remembered. The woman. Clara. He'd let her sleep in the barn. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside into the cool gray light of early morning, and there she was, standing at his chopping block, splitting logs with a rhythm that spoke of long practice. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and her sleeves were rolled up despite the cold. "What are you doing?" Lucas called out. Clara set the axe down and looked at him. "You're low on firewood. Winter's coming." "I know winter's coming," Lucas said, walking toward her. "I also know I told you to leave at first light." "It's not full light yet," Clara said, nodding toward the horizon where the sun was just beginning to bleed orange into the sky. Lucas opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't know whether to laugh or throw her off his land bodily. "You trying to be clever?" "No," Clara said. "I'm trying to be useful." "I don't need—" "Everyone needs help," Clara said quietly. She picked up the axe again. "You just don't want to admit it." Lucas stared at her, his jaw working. There was no accusation in her voice, no judgment, just that same maddening calm, like she could see straight through him and didn't mind what she found there. "Finish the stack," he said finally. "Then you go." Clara nodded and turned back to the wood. Lucas went inside and made breakfast, cornmeal mush and the last of the bacon from the smokehouse. He told himself he wasn't making enough for two. He told himself a lot of things that morning that weren't quite true. When the food was ready, he stepped out onto the porch and found Clara carrying an armload of split wood toward the cabin. "Leave it," he said. "Come eat." She hesitated, then set the wood down carefully and climbed the porch steps. Lucas handed her a plate and a fork, and they ate standing up, neither of them speaking. The sun climbed higher, turning the frost on the grass to glittering diamonds, and somewhere far off, a hawk cried out, sharp and lonely. "Why are you running?" Lucas asked. Clara looked up from her plate. "I'm not running. Everyone who walks 3 weeks into nowhere is running from something." She was quiet for a long time, her eyes on the distant hills. "My brother died last spring," she said finally. "Fever took him in 2 days. After that, the people who owned our land decided they didn't need me anymore. Said I could stay if I married the foreman's son." She paused. "I didn't want to marry him." "So you left?" "So I left." Lucas nodded slowly. He understood that kind of leaving, the kind where staying meant losing yourself piece by piece until there was nothing left worth keeping. "You got family anywhere?" he asked. "No." "Friends?" "No." "Nothing." "Nothing," Clara agreed. She looked at him then, and for the first time he saw something beneath the calm, a deep, old grief that she carried like stones in her pockets. "Just me." Lucas set his plate down on the porch rail. "You can stay another day," he said. "There's work that needs doing. I'll pay you in meals and a place to sleep. After that, you move on." Clara's expression didn't change, but he saw her shoulders drop just slightly, like she'd been holding her breath without realizing it. "All right." "Don't make me regret this," Lucas said. "I won't." He wanted to believe her. Against his better judgment, he almost did. That day, Clara worked like someone trying to prove the world wrong about her. She mucked out the barn, repaired a broken hinge on the corral gate, and somehow coaxed the temperamental mule into letting her brush the burrs out of its mane, something Lucas himself hadn't managed in 6 months. She didn't talk much, didn't ask questions, just moved from task to task with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. By evening, Lucas found himself watching her more than he wanted to admit. She moved through his space like she'd always been there, like the land recognized her in some way he couldn't quite explain. It bothered him. It also didn't. When the sun set and the temperature dropped, Clara returned to the barn without being told. Lucas stood on the porch and watched her go, the lantern light from the barn casting long shadows across the yard. "One more day," he muttered to himself. "Then she's gone." But when morning came, Clara was there again, and the morning after that, and the one after that. By the 4th day, Lucas stopped telling her to leave. He didn't invite her to stay exactly. He just stopped mentioning departure. And Clara, for her part, didn't ask permission. She simply kept working, mending what was broken, tending what was neglected, filling the silence with the sound of her labor. On the 5th morning, Lucas found her at the creek, breaking through the thin layer of ice that had formed overnight to fill the water buckets. Her hands were red and raw from the cold, but she didn't complain, didn't even seem to notice. "You don't have to do that," Lucas said, walking up behind her. Clara looked over her shoulder. "The animals need water." "I know they need water. That's my job." "Now it's both our jobs," Clara said simply, lifting one of the buckets. Lucas took it from her before she could protest. "Your hands are freezing." "They'll warm up." "Clara—" She turned to face him fully, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he saw something like defiance in her eyes. "I'm not a burden," she said quietly. "I won't be treated like one." "I didn't say you were—" "You're thinking it," Clara said. "I can see it. Every time you look at me, you're wondering when I'm going to ask for something you don't want to give. But I won't. I'll earn my keep, same as anyone. And when it's time to go, I'll go. But until then, let me work." Lucas stood there holding the bucket, water sloshing over the rim and soaking into the dirt at his feet. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to explain that it wasn't her work he minded. It was the way she made the silence feel less suffocating. The way the cabin seemed less empty when he knew she was just across the yard. The way he'd started listening for the sound of her footsteps in the morning like they were something to look forward to. "Fine," he said finally. "But wear gloves next time." The corner of Clara's mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close enough. "I don't have gloves." Lucas set the bucket down, pulled off his own worn leather gloves, and handed them to her. "Now you do." Clara looked at the gloves, then at him. For a moment he thought she might refuse, might insist she didn't need them. But instead she took them carefully, like they were something precious, and slipped them on. They were too big, the fingers hanging loose, but she flexed her hands and nodded once. "Thank you," she said. Lucas picked up both buckets and started back toward the barn. "Don't mention it." But as he walked away, he felt her watching him, and he knew, though he wouldn't admit it for weeks yet, that something fundamental had shifted. Clara Whitfield wasn't passing through anymore. She was staying, and he wasn't going to stop her. Winter came early that year, rolling down from the mountains in waves of gray cloud and bitter wind. The first real snow fell on a Tuesday, thick and fast, covering the prairie in a blanket of white that muffled all sound and made the world feel small and close. Lucas woke that morning to find Clara already outside, clearing a path from the cabin to the barn with a shovel she must have found in the equipment shed. He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the cold. "You're up early." "Animals don't care about snow," Clara said, not pausing in her work. "They still need feeding." Lucas grabbed the second shovel and joined her, and for a while they worked in companionable silence. The only sounds the scrape of metal on wood and the soft hiss of falling snow. When they finished, Clara leaned on her shovel and looked out at the white expanse of his land, her breath pluming in the frozen air. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Lucas followed her gaze. He'd seen 100 winters out here, maybe more. He'd stopped noticing the beauty a long time ago. But standing there beside her, watching the way the light caught on the snow crystals and turned everything to silver, he thought maybe he'd forgotten how to look at it right. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it is." Clara glanced at him, and something passed between them. Something wordless and fragile, like the first crack in ice before the thaw. Then she turned and headed toward the barn, and Lucas followed, his heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in his chest. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived, Lucas invited Clara to eat dinner inside the cabin instead of taking her meal out to the barn. She hesitated in the doorway, snow still clinging to her hair, and looked at him with those steady, unreadable eyes. "You sure?" she asked. "It's cold," Lucas said, "and I made too much stew." Both of those things were lies, but Clara didn't call him on them. She stepped inside, brushed the snow from her shoulders, and sat at the table while Lucas ladled stew into 2 chipped bowls. They ate without talking at first, the fire crackling in the stove and casting dancing shadows on the walls. "You fought in the war," Clara said after a while. It wasn't a question. Lucas looked up. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move," she said, "like you're always expecting something to come at you from behind." He set his spoon down slowly. "Union courier," he said. "Carried messages through contested territory. Spent 3 years riding through places I wasn't supposed to be, trying not to get shot." "Did you?" Clara asked. "Get shot?" "Twice," Lucas said. "Once in the shoulder, once in the leg. Neither one stuck." Clara nodded like that made perfect sense. "That's where you got the money for this place." "War pay and 4 years of saving every cent," Lucas said. "Figured if I survived, I'd buy myself somewhere quiet. Somewhere nobody could find me." "And then I showed up," Clara said softly. Lucas looked at her across the table, at the way the firelight caught in her dark eyes and softened the hard edges of her face. "Yeah," he said. "Then you showed up." "I can still leave," Clara said, "if that's what you want." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, turning his spoon over in his hand. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending snow skittering across the windows like restless ghosts. "I don't know what I want," he said finally, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in years. Clara reached across the table and for a wild second Lucas thought she might take his hand, but instead she picked up his empty bowl and carried it to the wash basin, moving through his kitchen like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "Then I'll stay," she said quietly, "until you figure it out." The days blurred together after that, each one bleeding into the next in a rhythm of work and weather and small, quiet moments that Lucas found himself looking forward to without meaning to. Clara kept sleeping in the barn. She insisted on it, said it wouldn't be proper otherwise, but she took her meals in the cabin now, and sometimes in the evenings she'd sit by the fire and mend clothes or read from the single battered book she'd carried in that broken carpet bag. It was a volume of poetry, the pages soft and worn from handling, and once Lucas asked her to read something aloud. She looked at him like he'd asked her to fly. "You want me to read to you?" she said. "Unless you think I can't understand it," Lucas said. Clara smiled then, a real smile, the first he'd seen from her, and opened the book to a page marked with a frayed ribbon. She read in a voice that was low and clear, something about autumn fields and the quiet dignity of growing things, and Lucas sat there and listened and felt something in him soften that he'd thought was frozen solid. When she finished, she closed the book carefully and looked at him. "Did you like it?" "I don't know," Lucas said honestly, "but I liked hearing you read it." Clara's cheeks flushed, just barely, and she looked down at the book in her lap. "My brother used to ask me to read to him," she said, "every night before bed, even when he got older, even when he could read just fine himself. He said my voice made the words sound better." "He was right," Lucas said. Clara's throat worked like she was swallowing something painful. "Thank you for letting me stay," she whispered. I know this isn't—" "Don't," Lucas said. He stood up and crossed to the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard where the barn light glowed warm and yellow against the dark. "You've earned your place here. You don't owe me gratitude." "Then what do I owe you?" Clara asked. Lucas turned to look at her. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something caught between hope and fear, and a dozen other things he didn't have names for. "Nothing," he said. "You don't owe me anything, Clara." She stood slowly, the book still clutched in her hands, and for a long moment they just looked at each other across the small space of the cabin. The fire popped and hissed. The wind howled outside like something searching. "I should go," Clara said finally. "It's late." Lucas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Clara walked to the door, pulled on the coat he'd given her 2 weeks ago when the temperature dropped below freezing, and paused with her hand on the latch. "Good night, Lucas." "Good night, Clara." She slipped out into the cold, and Lucas stood there for a long time after she'd gone, staring at the door and wondering what the hell he was doing. He'd built this life specifically to be alone, to be untouchable, to be safe from the kind of hurt that came from letting people too close. And now here was this woman, this quiet, stubborn, impossible woman, unraveling everything he'd carefully constructed, and he didn't have the strength to stop her. Worse than that, he didn't want to. Christmas came and went unmarked except for the fact that Lucas gave Clara a new pair of boots he'd ordered from the general store in town, and Clara gave him a scarf she'd knitted from yarn she'd somehow acquired without his knowledge. They exchanged gifts without ceremony, without explanation. And if Lucas noticed that Clara's eyes were brighter than usual, he didn't mention it. January was brutal. The snow piled up in drifts taller than a man, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the well overnight. They worked together to keep the animals alive, to keep the fires burning, to keep themselves from going mad in the endless white silence. And somewhere in all that work, in all those long frozen days, Lucas realized he was talking more than he had in years. He told Clara about the war, not the parts everyone wanted to hear, not the glory or the strategy, but the small true things. The way coffee tasted when you'd been riding for 3 days straight. The sound a horse makes when it's dying. The weight of carrying messages that might save lives or end them, never knowing which until it was too late. Clara listened without judgment, without trying to make it better. She just listened, and somehow that was enough. In turn, she told him about her brother, about how he used to catch fireflies in jars and keep them by his bedside like nightlights, about the way he laughed, high and bright and completely unself-conscious, about the morning she woke up and knew, before anyone said a word, that he was gone. I don't know how to stop missing him, Clara said one night, her voice breaking on the last word. Lucas reached out and took her hand, the first time he'd deliberately touched her since she'd arrived, and held it gently in his own. You don't, he said. You just learn to carry it different. Clara's fingers tightened around his, and they sat like that until the fire burned down to embers, and the cold crept back in. February brought a thaw, brief and treacherous. The snow turned to slush, and the creek swelled with runoff, and one afternoon Lucas came back from checking the fence line to find Clara standing in the yard, staring at something in her hands. "What is it?" he called out. Clara looked up, and he saw tears on her cheeks. She held out her hands, and there, cupped carefully in her palms, was a tiny bird, a junco, its feathers fluffed against the cold, its chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. "It flew into the window," Clara said. "I think its wing is broken." Lucas walked over and looked at the bird. It was terrified, its small heart beating so fast he could see it through the delicate skin. "Best thing is to put it out of its misery," he said gently. "It won't survive with a broken wing." "No," Clara said immediately. "We can help it." Clara, "Please," she said, looking up at him with those eyes that could stop his heart. "Let me try." So they tried. They made a nest out of an old crate and lined it with straw, and Clara fed the bird water from an eyedropper and tiny pieces of cracked corn, and she talked to it in that low, soothing voice like it could understand her. Lucas thought it was pointless, thought she was just delaying the inevitable. But 3 days later, the bird hopped to the edge of the crate and flexed its wing, tentative at first, then stronger. And on the 4th day, Clara carried the crate outside and opened it, and the junco paused for just a moment before launching itself into the gray winter sky, flying strong and true toward the mountains. Clara watched it go, her hand shading her eyes, and when she finally lowered her arm, she was smiling. "See?" she said to Lucas. "Sometimes things survive." Lucas looked at her, at the joy in her face, at the hope she carried like armor, and felt something inside him break open. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Sometimes they do." That night when Clara came in for dinner, Lucas met her at the door. "I don't want you sleeping in the barn anymore," he said. Clara froze, her hand still on the latch. "What?" "It's too cold," Lucas said. "And it's not right. You should have the cabin. I'll take the barn." "Lucas, I can't." "Or," he said, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, "you could stay here, in the cabin, with me." Clara stared at him, her eyes wide and dark in the dim light. "What are you saying?" Lucas took a breath. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not tomorrow, not next week, not ever. I'm saying this place feels wrong when you're not in it. I'm saying—" He stopped, the words tangling in his throat. Clara stepped closer, so close he could see the pulse jumping in her neck, could smell the clean scent of snow and wood smoke that clung to her skin. "Say it," she whispered. "I'm saying I want you to stay," Lucas said. "Not as a hired hand, not as someone passing through. I want you to stay as mine, if you'll have me." Clara's breath hitched. "Lucas?" "I know I'm not much," he said quickly. "I know I'm rough and I don't talk pretty, and I've got more ghosts than any man should carry, but I'll work hard, and I'll keep you safe, and I'll never, I swear to you, Clara, I'll never make you regret—" She kissed him. She rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his, cutting off his rambling words, and Lucas froze for just a moment before his hands came up to cup her face, before he kissed her back with everything he'd been holding inside for months. She tasted like hope and spring water and coming home. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara kept her forehead pressed against his. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay." Lucas pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her, and held on like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "Thank you." Clara laughed, the sound shaky and bright. "For what?" "For not leaving," Lucas said. "For staying even when I was too stupid to ask you to. For everything." She pulled back just enough to look at him, and her eyes were shining with tears and something fiercer, something that made his chest ache. "I wasn't going anywhere," she said. "Don't you know that by now? I wasn't ever going anywhere." And Lucas, who had spent years building walls and keeping people out, who had convinced himself that solitude was the same as safety, finally understood what he'd been too afraid to see. Clara Whitfield hadn't been passing through. She'd been coming home. They planned it all that night, sitting at the table with mugs of coffee gone cold, sketching out dreams on scraps of paper. A bigger house, facing east to catch the morning sun. Fences that would hold against the winter wind. A garden where Clara could grow vegetables and flowers, calendula and cornflowers and sweet peas climbing up trellises made from bent willow branches. They talked until dawn touched the windows, until the world outside turned from black to gray to gold. And when the sun finally rose, they walked out together to watch it, Clara's hand warm in his. "We'll make it work," Lucas said. "I know," Clara said. "We will." And standing there in the clear, cold light of a Wyoming morning, with the woman who had refused to leave his side even when he'd given her every reason to, Lucas Hale finally stopped running from the thing he'd wanted most. He let himself believe in a future that wasn't lonely. He let himself believe in her. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved to be happy. The wind blew across the prairie, carrying the scent of thawing earth and new beginnings, and Lucas breathed it in and felt something inside him shift and settle, like a bone slipping back into place after being broken too long. This was home now. Not just the land, not just the buildings. This, her, them. The days after that night moved differently, like time itself had shifted its weight and settled into a new rhythm. Lucas woke each morning to the sound of Clara moving through the cabin, building up the fire, putting coffee on to boil. He'd lie there for a moment, listening to her footsteps, still half convinced he'd imagined it all. That he'd open his eyes and find the cabin empty again, find himself alone the way he'd been for so long. But then she'd turn and see him awake, and she'd smile, and the fear would dissolve like morning frost in sunlight. "You're staring," Clara said one morning, catching him watching her from the bed. "Maybe I am," Lucas said. She shook her head, but her cheeks colored, and she turned back to the stove with something that might have been pleasure softening the line of her shoulders. Lucas got up and dressed, and they fell into the work of the day side by side, the way they had for months now, except everything felt different. Every accidental touch carried weight. Every shared glance held meaning. They hadn't talked about what came next, about marriage or forever or any of the practical things that probably needed discussing. They just lived in the moment, in the slow unfolding of something neither of them had quite expected to find. But the territory had a way of forcing decisions, and it came in the form of a letter delivered by a rider from town 3 weeks after that first kiss. Lucas was out checking the north fence when he saw the horse approaching, and by the time he made it back to the cabin, Clara was standing on the porch with an envelope in her hands, her face pale. "What is it?" Lucas asked, swinging down from his saddle. "It's addressed to you," Clara said, holding it out. "From someone named Garrett." Lucas felt his stomach tighten. He took the envelope and turned it over, recognizing the handwriting immediately. Thomas Garrett had been his commanding officer during the war, the man who'd kept him alive through 3 years of hell and chaos. They'd stayed in touch sporadically after the fighting ended, but it had been more than a year since Lucas had heard from him. He tore open the envelope and read quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each line. "What does it say?" Clara asked quietly. Lucas looked up. "He's offering me a job. Security work for a railroad company expanding east out of Wyoming. Good pay, steady work, based out of Cheyenne." Clara's face went very still. "That's 3 days' ride from here." "4 in winter," Lucas said. He folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. "It doesn't matter. I'm not interested." "Lucas, I said it doesn't matter," he repeated, more sharply than he intended. He saw Clara flinch, just slightly, and hated himself for it. "I'm not leaving this place. I'm not leaving you." Clara stepped down from the porch and put her hand on his arm. "It's good money," she said. "You should at least consider it." "There's nothing to consider." "What if the ranch fails?" Clara asked. "What if we have a bad season, or the cattle get sick, or—" "Then we'll figure it out," Lucas said. He caught her hand and held it tight. "Together. Here. Not in some railroad camp 300 miles away." Clara searched his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "But promise me something." Anything. Promise me you won't resent me for it, Clara said. Promise me that 10 years from now, when money's tight and the work is hard, you won't look at me and wish you'd taken that job. Lucas pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her, and rested his chin on top of her head. I promise, he said. The only thing I'd ever resent is not having you here. She held him tighter, her fingers clutching at his shirt. I'm scared, she whispered. Of what? Of being happy, Clara said. Of having something good and then losing it. Lucas understood that fear better than she knew. He'd spent years running from it, hiding from it, building walls to keep it out. But standing there with Clara in his arms, he realized something he should have known all along. The fear didn't go away just because you avoided the thing that scared you. It just grew larger in the absence, filling up all the empty spaces until there was nothing left but fear and loneliness and the slow erosion of hope. I'm scared too, he said. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. Clara pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You mean that? Every word. She kissed him then, soft and fierce, and Lucas tasted salt on her lips and knew she was crying even though she was smiling. When they broke apart, she kept her hands on his face, her thumbs tracing the line of his jaw like she was memorizing the shape of him. We should get married, Clara said. Lucas blinked. What? We should get married, she repeated. Properly, with vows and everything. I thought we were, I assumed. I want it official, Clara said. I want everyone to know I'm yours and you're mine. I want it written down somewhere that we chose each other, that this wasn't just convenience or desperation or... Lucas kissed her quiet, cutting off the spiral of her words. Yes, he said against her mouth. Yes, we'll get married. Tomorrow if you want. Clara laughed, shaky and bright. Not tomorrow, but soon. How soon? Give me 2 weeks, Clara said. I want to make a dress, something nice, something I can keep. Lucas thought about the worn, practical dresses she owned, the way she mended them carefully each night, making them last because she had nothing else. He thought about the pride in her voice when she talked about making something nice, something worth keeping. 2 weeks, he agreed. But Clara. Yes? You could wear a flour sack and you'd still be the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. She blushed and shoved at his chest, but she was smiling, and that smile stayed with Lucas through the rest of the day, warming him from the inside out. That afternoon, he rode into town and bought fabric, soft blue cotton that reminded him of summer skies, and white lace for the collar and cuffs. He bought thread and needles and a pair of pearl buttons that cost more than he wanted to spend, but that he knew Clara would love. The woman at the general store raised her eyebrows when she saw his purchases, but didn't ask questions, and Lucas was grateful for the discretion. When he got back to the ranch, he found Clara in the barn brushing down one of the horses. She looked up when he walked in, and he held out the parcels without saying a word. What's this? Clara asked. Open it. She set down the brush and took the packages, unwrapping them slowly. When she saw the fabric, her breath caught. She ran her fingers over the soft cotton, touched the delicate lace, held the pearl buttons up to the light streaming through the barn door. Lucas, she whispered, this is too much. It's not enough, he said, but it's what I could afford. Clara looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, and before he could ask if he'd done something wrong, she launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck and holding on like he was the only solid thing in a shifting world. Thank you, she said into his shoulder. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Lucas held her and felt his own throat tighten. You don't have to thank me for giving you what you deserve. I deserve you, Clara said fiercely, pulling back to look at him. That's what I deserve. Everything else is just extra. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth. Then you've got me, he said, for as long as you want me. Forever, Clara said. I want you forever. Then forever it is. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended state, like they were living in a pocket of time separate from the rest of the world. Clara worked on her dress in the evenings, sitting by the fire with the fabric spread across her lap, her needle moving in quick, sure strokes. Lucas pretended not to watch, pretended to be absorbed in mending tack or reading the old newspapers he'd brought back from town. But he saw every stitch she took, every satisfied smile when a seam came out straight. During the day, they prepared the ranch for what came next. Lucas started framing out an addition to the cabin, 2 new rooms that would give them space to grow, space for the future they were building together. Clara planned her garden, marking out plots in the dirt with stakes and string, talking about tomatoes and beans and the climbing roses she wanted to plant near the porch. "Roses are temperamental," Lucas said, watching her work. "So am I," Clara replied without looking up. "We'll get along fine." He laughed, and the sound surprised him, loose and genuine and completely unself-conscious. Clara glanced over and smiled, and Lucas thought that maybe this was what happiness felt like. Not the big dramatic moments, but the small, quiet ones. The ordinary magic of building a life with someone who saw you clearly and chose you anyway. On the night before their wedding, Clara finished the dress. She held it up to show Lucas, and even in the dim lamplight, it was beautiful, simple and clean, with the lace at the collar catching the light like frost on glass. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think I'm the luckiest man in the territory," Lucas said. Clara rolled her eyes, but she was smiling as she carefully folded the dress and set it aside. "We should sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's a big day." "Clara?" She paused, looking back at him. "Yes?" "I love you," Lucas said. The words felt strange in his mouth, unfamiliar, like a language he'd forgotten he knew. "I should have said it before now, but I love you." Clara crossed the room and took his face in her hands. "I love you too," she said. "I have since the day you let me stay, even though you didn't want to. Maybe even before that. How could you love me before you knew me?" "Because I saw who you were trying to be," Clara said, "and I knew that man was worth waiting for." Lucas pulled her close and held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "I'll try to be worth it," he said. "Every day, I'll try." "You already are," Clara whispered. "You already are." They married at dawn, standing in the front yard of the ranch with the minister from town as their only witness. Lucas wore his cleanest shirt and the black vest he'd bought in Cheyenne 5 years ago and never had occasion to wear. Clara wore her blue dress with the pearl buttons, and she'd woven wildflowers into her hair, early primrose and wild iris that she must have walked miles to find. She was so beautiful it hurt to look at her. The minister read the vows, his voice carrying across the empty prairie, and Lucas spoke his promises clearly and firmly, meaning every word. When it was Clara's turn, her voice shook only once, on the word forever, but then she steadied and finished strong. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister said. "You may kiss your bride." Lucas stepped forward and cupped Clara's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "Hello, Mrs. Hale," he said softly. Clara smiled through her tears. "Hello, husband." He kissed her gently, reverently, sealing the promise they'd made to each other in front of witnesses both human and divine. When they broke apart, Clara was laughing, bright and joyful, and Lucas thought his heart might burst from the sheer overwhelming rightness of it all. The minister stayed for coffee and congratulations, then rode back toward town, leaving Lucas and Clara alone in the pale morning light. They stood together on the porch, Clara's hand in his, watching the sun climb higher in the sky and paint the world in shades of gold. "So this is it," Clara said. "We're really married." "Having second thoughts?" Lucas asked. "Not a single one." She squeezed his hand. "You?" "No," Lucas said. "Not one." They went back inside, and Clara changed out of her wedding dress and carefully hung it in the wardrobe, running her fingers over the fabric one last time before closing the door. Lucas watched her, struck by the simple domesticity of the moment, by how natural it felt to share this space with her. "What should we do now?" Clara asked, turning to face him. Lucas pulled her close and kissed her temple. "Whatever we want," he said. "We've got the rest of our lives to figure it out." They spent the day working side by side, the same as always, except now there were rings on their fingers. Simple bands Lucas had bought from a traveling jeweler last month, plain gold that caught the light when they moved. Clara kept looking at hers, turning her hand this way and that, like she couldn't quite believe it was real. That night, they lay together in the darkness, Clara's head on Lucas's chest, his arm around her shoulders. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like the ocean, and somewhere far off a coyote sang to the rising moon. "Tell me something," Clara said softly. "Something you've never told anyone else." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. "During the war," he said finally, "there was a night when I thought I was going to die. I'd been riding for 3 days straight, carrying dispatches, and I got caught between two advancing armies. Confederate scouts on one side, Union deserters on the other, both of them willing to shoot first and ask questions never." Clara shifted, pressing closer. "What did you do?" "I hid," Lucas said. "Found a ravine and laid flat in the mud for 18 hours while they searched for me. I could hear them calling to each other, could hear their horses passing so close I could have reached out and touched them. And I remember thinking that if I died there, alone in the mud, nobody would ever know. Nobody would care." "I would have cared," Clara said. Lucas smiled in the darkness. "You didn't know me then." "Doesn't matter," Clara said fiercely. "I would have cared anyway." He kissed the top of her head. "Your turn. Tell me something." Clara was silent for so long that Lucas thought she might have fallen asleep, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "After my brother died," she said, "I used to go out to his grave every morning and talk to him. I'd tell him about my day, about what I was planning to do, about the weather, and I kept doing it even after I left Kansas. I'd find a quiet spot and sit down and talk to him like he was right there beside me." "Do you still do it?" Lucas asked. "Sometimes," Clara admitted, "but not as much. I think he'd want me to be happy, to live my life instead of spending it talking to ghosts." Lucas tightened his arm around her. "He'd be proud of you," he said, "of how strong you are, of how far you've come." "I'm not that strong," Clara said. "You walked 3 weeks across hostile territory with nothing but a broken bag and hope," Lucas said. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." Clara laughed softly, wetly. "I was terrified every single day." "Being scared doesn't make you weak," Lucas said. "Doing it anyway, that's what makes you strong." They drifted into sleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Lucas dreamed of a future that stretched out clear and bright, full of ordinary miracles and hard-won joy. The weeks that followed were good ones. Spring crept across the prairie in waves of green, and the work of the ranch intensified. They built the new rooms onto the cabin, working from dawn until dusk, measuring and cutting and fitting the boards together with careful precision. Clara proved surprisingly handy with a hammer, and Lucas caught himself watching her more than once, admiring the sure way she moved, the competence in her hands. "You're staring again," Clara said without looking up from the board she was nailing into place. "Can't help it," Lucas said. "You're distracting." She threw a wood chip at him, and he laughed and ducked and went back to work, feeling lighter than he had in years. But the territory had a way of reminding people that peace was always temporary, and the reminder came on a Tuesday afternoon when Lucas rode to town for supplies and came back to find a stranger standing in their front yard. He was tall and lean, dressed in expensive clothes that didn't belong in Wyoming, with a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't twisted into an expression of calculated disdain. He was looking at the cabin like it offended him personally, and when he heard Lucas's horse, he turned with the kind of casual arrogance that set Lucas's teeth on edge. "Can I help you?" Lucas asked, not dismounting. "Are you Lucas Hale?" the man asked. His voice was educated, Eastern, completely out of place. "Who's asking?" "My name is Richard Whitfield," the man said. "I'm looking for my sister." Lucas felt the world tilt sideways. He'd known Clara had family back in Kansas, had known they'd parted on bad terms, but she'd never mentioned a brother. Never mentioned Richard. "Your sister," Lucas repeated slowly. "Clara Whitfield," Richard said. "I have reason to believe she came through this area. Small woman, brown hair, probably traveling alone and in poor condition." "What makes you think she'd be here?" Richard smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Because I've been tracking her for 3 months, Mr. Hale. And multiple sources in town informed me that you recently married a woman matching her description." Lucas dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening, even though every instinct was screaming at him to throw this man off his land bodily. "What do you want with her?" "That's between Clara and myself," Richard said. "Now, If you'd be so kind as to fetch her. No. Richard's eyebrows rose. I beg your pardon? I said no, Lucas repeated. You don't get to show up here making demands. This is my property, and Clara is my wife. Whatever business you think you have with her, you can state it to me first. Something dangerous flickered in Richard's eyes. I see, he said softly. She didn't tell you, did she? Tell me what? That she's a thief, Richard said. That when she ran away from Kansas, she took something that didn't belong to her. Something valuable. Lucas felt cold fury rising in his chest. Clara's not a thief. No? Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I have a signed affidavit from the property owner stating that Clara Whitfield stole a sum of money, quite a substantial sum, before fleeing in the night. I also have a warrant for her arrest. He held out the paper, and Lucas snatched it from his hand, scanning the text quickly. The words blurred together. Theft, warrant, Kansas Territorial Court, but the signature at the bottom was clear enough. It was signed by a judge Lucas had never heard of, from a town he'd never been to. This is bullshit, Lucas said flatly. I assure you it's quite legal, Richard said. Now, I'm willing to be reasonable about this. Clara returns the money she stole, along with interest for the trouble she's caused, and I'll forget the whole unfortunate incident. But if she refuses... Lucas? Both men turned. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, her face pale, one hand braced against the doorframe like she needed it to stay upright. She was looking at Richard with an expression Lucas had never seen before, pure, visceral fear. Clara, Richard said, his voice softening into something that might have passed for warmth if you didn't look too closely. There you are. I've been so worried. You need to leave, Clara said. Her voice was shaking but firm. Right now. I'm afraid I can't do that, Richard said. Not until we settle our business. We don't have any business, Clara said. I don't owe you anything. You owe me $200, Richard said. The exact amount you took from the household account before you disappeared. Lucas looked at Clara. Is that true? Clara's eyes met his, and he saw desperation there, and shame, and something that looked almost like grief. Yes, she whispered. But it's not. It's not how he's making it sound. Then explain it to me, Lucas said quietly. Clara came down from the porch, moving like she was walking through deep water. She stopped a few feet away from Richard, far enough that he couldn't easily reach her, close enough that Lucas could see she was trembling. After my brother died, Clara said, the family I worked for decided they didn't need me anymore. But they'd been holding my wages for years, said they were keeping it safe for me. When I asked for my money so I could leave, Richard told me there was no money, that I'd already been paid in room and board. That's a lie, Richard said calmly. You were paid every cent you were owed. I worked for your family for 8 years, Clara said, her voice rising. 8 years of cooking and cleaning and taking care of your children and your sick mother. And when I asked for my wages, you told me I'd never been an employee, I'd been charity, that I should be grateful you'd taken me in at all. How ungrateful you sound, Richard said, after everything we did for you. You did nothing for me. Clara's hands were clenched into fists at her sides. You worked me like a servant and paid me nothing, and then tried to force me to marry a man I despised so you could keep me trapped there forever. Is that what you told your husband? Richard asked, glancing at Lucas. Did you tell him you were a desperate thief running from the law? Or did you spin him some tragic story about being an orphan with nowhere to go? Get off my land, Lucas said. His voice was very quiet, very calm, and very dangerous. Richard looked at him with something like amusement. Or what? Or I'll remove you, Lucas said, and I won't be gentle about it. You'd assault me, Richard said, over a woman you've known for what, 6 months? A woman who's clearly been lying to you from the beginning? Clara hasn't lied to me about anything that matters, Lucas said. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. And you've got about 30 seconds to get back on your horse before I make you regret showing your face here. Richard's expression hardened. I have a legal warrant. From a Kansas court, Lucas said, which has exactly 0 authority in Wyoming territory. So unless you want to ride all the way to Cheyenne and try to convince a territorial judge that this case is worth pursuing, I suggest you take your fake warrant and your threats and get the hell away from my wife." Richard stared at him for a long moment, and Lucas could see him calculating odds, weighing options. Finally, he smiled, cold and thin and full of promise. "This isn't over," Richard said. "Clara knows that." "Don't you, Clara?" Clara didn't answer. She just stood there, rigid and pale, her breathing shallow and fast. Richard walked to his horse with unhurried precision, mounted smoothly, and looked down at them from the saddle. "I'll be back," he said, "with proper authorities and proper documentation. And when I return, Mr. Hale, you won't be able to protect her." He turned his horse and rode away, and Lucas watched until he disappeared over the rise. Only then did he turn to Clara, who had started to shake so badly her teeth were chattering. "Clara, I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I should have—" Lucas pulled her against his chest and held her while she broke apart, while she sobbed into his shirt and shook like she was coming apart at the seams. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He just held her and let her cry, one hand stroking her hair, the other firm against her back. When the storm finally passed, Clara pulled back just enough to look up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Do you hate me?" she whispered. "No," Lucas said. "Never." "I took the money," Clara said. "He's right about that. I went into the house account and I took $200 and I left in the middle of the night without telling anyone. I'm a thief, Lucas. Everything he said was—" "Stop," Lucas said firmly. He cupped her face in his hands, making her look at him. "Did they pay you for your work?" "No, but did you earn that money?" "Yes, but they said—" "I don't care what they said," Lucas interrupted. "You worked for 8 years and they paid you nothing. As far as I'm concerned, you took what was already yours." "The law won't see it that way," Clara said. "Then the law is wrong," Lucas said simply. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her trembling mouth. "You're not going back there, Clara. Not to him, not to that family, not to that life. I won't let it happen." "He'll come back," Clara said. "He won't give up." "Let him come," Lucas said. "I'm not afraid of Richard Whitfield." But as he held Clara against his chest and felt her heart racing like a frightened bird, Lucas knew the peace they'd found was already fraying at the edges. Richard would come back. That much was certain. And when he did, Lucas would have to find a way to protect the woman he loved from a past that refused to stay buried. The question was how far he was willing to go. And the answer, Lucas realized with a clarity that should have frightened him, was as far as it took. That night, neither of them slept. Clara lay rigid beside Lucas in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, her breathing too controlled to be natural. Lucas kept one arm around her, feeling the tension coiled in her body like a spring wound too tight, waiting for the moment it would snap. "Talk to me," he said finally, when the silence became unbearable. "What do you want me to say?" Clara's voice was hollow, scraped clean of emotion. "Anything, everything, whatever you need to." Clara was quiet for so long that Lucas thought she might refuse. Then she took a shaky breath and the words came spilling out, raw and painful. "The Whitfield family took me in when I was 14, she said. "My parents had died the year before, cholera, and my brother and I were living with an aunt who didn't want us. When Mrs. Whitfield's housekeeper left, the aunt suggested me, said I was a hard worker, good with my hands. Mrs. Whitfield agreed to try me out for room and board and $2 a month." Lucas's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I worked there for 2 years before Mrs. Whitfield got sick," Clara continued. "Cancer, the doctor said, though they didn't tell her that. Just said she needed rest and care. Richard asked me to take on nursing duties along with the housework. Said the family would make it worth my while when his mother recovered." "But she didn't recover," Lucas said quietly. "No. She died 3 years later, and by then I'd been working 16-hour days for almost no pay, caring for a dying woman while also running the household. Richard's father had passed the year before, so Richard became head of the family. He told me he appreciated everything I'd done, that the family considered me almost one of their own." Clara's voice turned bitter. "Almost. Never quite enough to actually treat me like family, but enough to make me feel obligated. And your brother?" "Thomas was staying with another family in town, working in their stable. He was happy there. Safe. I saw him every Sunday after church, and we'd walk by the creek and he'd tell me about the horses he was training, the things he was learning. Her voice broke. He wanted to have his own ranch someday, wanted to breed horses, the good kind, the kind that could run all day and never tire. Lucas pulled her closer, feeling her tremble against him. When Thomas got sick, I used what little money I'd saved to pay for the doctor. Then I used the household account. Just borrowed it, I told myself. I'd pay it back. But Thomas died anyway, and suddenly I owed the Whitfield family money I didn't have. Richard said he'd forgive the debt if I stayed on, worked it off. He was very generous about it. The sarcasm in her voice could have cut glass. Then his foreman started paying attention to me. Marcus Tully. He was 43 years old, missing half his teeth, and mean when he drank, which was most nights. Christ, Lucas muttered. Richard encouraged it, said Marcus was a good man, steady work, that I should be grateful someone wanted to marry me at all. When I refused, Richard changed tactics. Said if I didn't marry Marcus, he'd report me to the sheriff for theft. Said I'd stolen from the household account, which was true, technically, even though I'd only borrowed what I should have been paid years ago. So you took the money and ran, Lucas said. I took what I'd earned, Clara corrected fiercely. I calculated every day I'd worked, every task I'd performed, every night I'd sat up with Mrs. Whitfield while she screamed in pain. $200 was less than half what they owed me, but it was all I could carry without being obvious. I left before dawn on a Tuesday, and I didn't look back. Lucas turned onto his side to face her, even though he could barely see her features in the darkness. You did the right thing. Did I? Clara's laugh was harsh and humorless. Because it feels like I just traded one trap for another. Richard won't stop, Lucas. He's not the kind of man who lets things go. It's not even about the money. It's about control, about winning. He'll come back with real lawmen, real papers, and there won't be anything we can do. We'll fight it, Lucas said. How? We don't have money for lawyers. We don't have connections. We're nobody, Lucas. Two people alone on the edge of nowhere, and Richard is rich and educated and has the whole weight of respectable society behind him. I don't care what he has, Lucas said. He's not taking you. Clara turned to look at him, and even in the darkness he could see the desperation in her eyes. What if you don't have a choice? There's always a choice, Lucas said. He caught her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, over his heart. Feel that? That's me choosing you. Every beat, every breath, I'm choosing you. And I'll keep choosing you until the day I die, no matter who tries to stop me. Even if it costs you everything? You are everything, Lucas said simply. Everything else is just details. Clara's composure finally cracked. She buried her face against his chest and sobbed, great wrenching sounds that tore at Lucas's heart. He held her through it, murmuring wordless comfort, his hands steady on her back even as his mind raced ahead, planning, calculating, preparing for the fight he knew was coming. When Clara finally exhausted herself into sleep, Lucas lay awake watching the slow wheel of stars through the window and made a decision. Richard Whitfield wanted a fight? He'd get one. But it wouldn't be fought in courtrooms or with legal papers. It would be fought the way Lucas had learned to fight during the war, with strategy and stubbornness and a willingness to do whatever it took to protect what mattered. He just hoped Clara could forgive him for what he was about to do. The next morning, Lucas rode to town while Clara stayed behind to work on the garden. He told her he was getting supplies, which was true as far as it went. He just didn't mention that his primary errand was meeting with John Graves, the closest thing the settlement had to a lawman. He found Graves at the saloon, nursing coffee that had gone cold and reviewing a ledger of unpaid debts. The man looked up when Lucas walked in, his weathered face creasing into something approximating a smile. "Hail," he said by way of greeting. "Don't often see you in town twice in 1 week." "Got a problem," Lucas said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Need your advice." Graves closed his ledger and gave Lucas his full attention. "I'm listening." Lucas laid out the situation as clearly as he could. Clara's history with the Whitfield family, Richard's accusations, the dubious warrant. Graves listened without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "You seen this warrant yourself?" Graves asked when Lucas finished. "I have. It's signed by a judge in Kansas, dated about 3 months back." "Kansas?" Graves repeated, leaning back in his chair. Well, that's something. Kansas Territorial Court has no jurisdiction here. Even if the warrant's legitimate, Richard would need to get it validated by a Wyoming judge before he could enforce it. How hard is that to do? Graves shrugged. Depends on the judge, depends on the evidence, depends on how much money Richard's willing to spend. Could take weeks, could take months. Could never happen at all if the Wyoming court decides the original case doesn't have merit. Lucas felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. So, Clara's safe for now. For now, Graves agreed. But Hale, I need to ask you something straight. Go ahead. Did your wife steal that money? Lucas met his eyes without flinching. She took wages she'd earned and was never paid. The Whitfield family exploited her labor for years, and then tried to coerce her into marriage when she asked for what she was owed. So, no, I don't consider it theft. Graves studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough, but the law might see it different, and you need to be prepared for that. If Richard pushes this hard enough, if he gets the right judge to listen to his side of the story, Clara could be looking at criminal charges. What are our options? Best option? Settle with Richard privately, pay back the money, get him to withdraw the complaint, make the whole thing go away. Lucas shook his head. We don't have $200, and even if we did, I wouldn't give that bastard the satisfaction. Then your second option is to wait and see if Richard actually follows through. Most of these cases, the person making the accusation loses interest when they realize how much work it's going to take. They go home, they move on, they find something else to be angry about. Richard's not most people, Lucas said. He'll follow through. Then you might want to consider your third option, Graves said carefully, which is to relocate. Take Clara somewhere Richard can't find you. Montana, maybe, or Colorado. Start fresh where nobody knows your history. Lucas felt something cold settle in his gut. You're telling me to run. I'm telling you to be smart, Graves said. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to not be there when the punches start flying. I'm not leaving my land, Lucas said flatly. I built that ranch with my own hands. It's mine and Clara's, and we're not giving it up because some rich man from Kansas has a grudge. Graves sighed and rubbed his face with both hands. Then you better lawyer up, Hale, because if Richard comes back with a Wyoming warrant, I won't have a choice but to enforce it. You'd arrest Clara? Lucas asked quietly. I'd have to, Graves said, meeting his eyes. That's the job. But between you and me, I do everything in my power to delay it, to give you time to mount a defense. I don't like men who abuse their power, and from what you've told me, Richard Whitfield is exactly that kind of man. Lucas stood and offered his hand. I appreciate the honesty. Graves shook it firmly. Watch your back, Hale. Men like Richard don't fight fair, and they don't quit easy. Neither do I, Lucas said. He left the saloon and spent the next hour making quiet inquiries around town. Who knew Richard, where he was staying, what he'd been asking about? The picture that emerged was troubling. Richard had rented a room at the boarding house and made it clear he planned to stay for a while. He'd been asking questions about Lucas and Clara, about their marriage, about whether anyone had witnessed it. He'd also been spreading rumors. Nothing overt, just careful suggestions that Clara was unstable, that Lucas had been taken in by a convincing liar, that the whole situation was more complicated than it appeared. It was a character assassination campaign, subtle and effective, and Lucas could see it working. By the time he headed back to the ranch, several townspeople who'd been friendly before now gave him wary looks, like they weren't sure what to believe anymore. Clara was waiting on the porch when he rode up, her arms crossed over her chest. How bad is it? She asked without preamble. It's manageable, Lucas said, dismounting and tying his horse. Richard doesn't have jurisdiction here. He'd need to get a Wyoming judge to validate his warrant, which could take months. But he's staying in town, Clara said. It wasn't a question. He's staying in town, Lucas confirmed, and he's talking to people, spreading his version of events. Clara's jaw tightened. Let me guess, I'm the villain in his story. You're the confused, troubled woman who ran away from people who only wanted to help you, Lucas said. He's very sympathetic about the whole thing, very concerned for your well-being. Of course he is. Clara turned and walked into the cabin, and Lucas followed. She started pulling vegetables from the basket on the counter with sharp, angry movements. This is exactly what he does. He destroys your reputation first, makes sure everyone thinks he's reasonable and you're hysterical, so that when he finally moves against you, nobody questions it. We won't let him, Lucas said. Clara laughed bitterly. How are we going to stop him, Lucas? We can't afford a lawyer. We don't have influential friends. We're outsiders here. We've been here less than a year. Richard is educated, wealthy, respectable. Who do you think people are going to believe? They'll believe us, Lucas said, because we're telling the truth. The truth doesn't matter, Clara said, slamming a potato down on the cutting board. Not when the lie is more convenient to believe. Lucas crossed the room and caught her hands, stilling their frantic movement. Look at me, he said. When she finally met his eyes, he saw fear there, but also fury, a deep burning anger that had probably been building for years. We're going to fight this, not by running, not by hiding, but by standing our ground and making Richard prove every single thing he's accusing you of. And if he can't, and he won't be able to, then the case falls apart. You make it sound so simple, Clara whispered. It's not simple, Lucas said, but it's possible. And that's enough. Clara sagged against him, and Lucas held her, feeling the fight drain out of her body. I'm tired, she said. I'm so tired of running, of being afraid, of waiting for the next bad thing to happen. I know, Lucas said into her hair, but you're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, we face it together. She nodded against his chest, and they stood like that until the afternoon light began to fade, and the temperature dropped with the coming evening. The next few days passed in tense waiting. Lucas worked on the ranch with one eye always on the road, expecting Richard or lawmen or trouble in some form. Clara threw herself into the garden with fierce determination, digging and planting and weeding like she could create something permanent through sheer force of will. They didn't talk about Richard, didn't acknowledge the threat hanging over them, but it was there in every moment, in the way Lucas always kept his rifle close, in the way Clara startled at unexpected sounds, in the way they held each other at night like they were afraid of being torn apart. On the fourth day, the storm Lucas had been expecting finally broke. He was in the barn, repairing a broken stall door, when he heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside to find 5 men riding into his yard. Richard Whitfield, John Graves, 2 men Lucas didn't recognize wearing deputy badges, and a thin man in a suit carrying a leather satchel. "Hale!" Graves called out, his voice heavy with reluctance. "We need to talk." Lucas walked forward slowly, the rifle held loose but ready. About what? The man in the suit dismounted and pulled a document from his satchel. "Mr. Hale, my name is Edmund Pierce. I'm a territorial judge. I've been presented with evidence regarding your wife, Clara Hale, formerly Clara Whitfield, and I've issued a warrant for her arrest on charges of theft." Lucas felt the world narrow to a single point. "You can't be serious." "I'm quite serious," Pierce said. He handed the document to Graves, who took it with obvious distaste. "Mr. Whitfield has provided substantial documentation supporting his claim, including financial records, witness statements, and sworn testimony regarding the missing money. Based on this evidence, I have probable cause to believe Mrs. Hale committed theft, and she must surrender herself for trial." "Let me see that documentation," Lucas demanded. Pierce pulled out several more papers, bank statements showing withdrawals from the Whitfield household account, statements from servants claiming Clara had acted suspiciously before disappearing, a letter from the foreman, Marcus Tully, expressing concern about Clara's erratic behavior in the weeks before she left. It was all fabricated, or at least twisted beyond recognition, but it looked official, it looked convincing, and Lucas could see from Graves's expression that the lawman's hands were tied. "Where's Mrs. Hale?" Pierce asked. "She's not here," Lucas lied. "Mr. Hale, I strongly advise you not to obstruct justice," Pierce said. "If your wife is on the premises, she needs to surrender herself immediately. If you're hiding her, you'll be charged as an accessory." The cabin door opened, and Clara stepped out onto the porch. She'd changed into her blue wedding dress, Lucas noticed with a pang. She looked small and pale, but composed, her chin lifted in defiance. "I'm here," she said clearly. "I'm Clara Hale." "Mrs. Hale," Pierce said, his voice taking on a false gentleness that made Lucas want to hit him. "I need you to come with us. You'll be held in town until your trial date can be set." "No," Lucas said flatly. He moved to stand between Clara and the men, the rifle rising slightly. She's not going anywhere. Lucas, don't, Clara said quietly behind him. Mr. Hale, you're making this worse, Graves said. Put the rifle down and let us do our jobs. Your job is to protect people from injustice, Lucas said, not to help rich men abuse the law to get revenge. That's not what's happening here, Pierce said, though his eyes said otherwise. This is a legal matter being handled through proper channels. The hell it is, Lucas said. Richard fabricated evidence and bought himself a friendly judge, and now you're doing his dirty work for him. Those are serious accusations, Pierce said coldly. Do you have proof? Do you? Lucas shot back. Real proof, not whatever lies Richard fed you? Richard had been silent until now, sitting on his horse with an expression of calculated patience. This is becoming tiresome, he said. Clara, you have a choice. You can come peacefully and face justice like a civilized person, or your husband can make this violent and end up in chains beside you. Which do you prefer? Clara stepped around Lucas before he could stop her. I'll come, she said. I won't let Lucas get hurt because of me. Clara, no. She turned to face him, and the look in her eyes stopped his protest cold. It's all right, she said softly. We knew this might happen. I'll go to town, I'll stand trial, and I'll prove I didn't do anything wrong. You can't prove a negative, Lucas said desperately. That's not how this works. They'll twist everything. They'll make you look guilty no matter what you say. Then I'll look guilty, Clara said. She reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle against his cheek. But I won't let you throw your life away trying to protect me from something that might not even happen. It will happen, Lucas said. Richard will make sure of it. Maybe, Clara said, or maybe I'll surprise you. Maybe I'm stronger than you think. She turned to Graves. I'm ready. Graves dismounted and pulled out a pair of iron manacles. Lucas had to physically restrain himself from knocking them out of the lawman's hands. Clara held out her wrists without being asked, and Graves locked the manacles around them with obvious reluctance. I'm sorry, Graves muttered, too low for anyone else to hear. I know, Clara said. They helped her onto one of the horses, and Lucas watched it happen with a sense of unreality, like he was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except him. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But it was real, and Clara was riding away from him, her blue dress bright against the gray sky, and Lucas stood there with a rifle in his hands and murder in his heart. Richard rode past him, close enough that Lucas could have reached out and grabbed him. Don't do anything foolish, Hale, he said quietly. You wouldn't want to make Clara a widow before she even gets convicted. Lucas met his eyes and saw the satisfaction there, the cruel pleasure of a man who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. This isn't over, Lucas said. Oh, I think it is, Richard said, but feel free to prove me wrong. He rode off, following the others, and Lucas stood in the empty yard watching them disappear down the road. When they were finally out of sight, he lowered the rifle and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The cabin felt enormous and empty without Clara in it. Lucas walked through the rooms they'd shared, touching things she'd touched. The blue fabric scraps from her wedding dress, the poetry book on the bedside table, the jar of wildflowers she'd picked yesterday and never gotten to put in water. Everything reminded him of her absence, and the weight of it was crushing. He couldn't let this stand. Couldn't let Richard win. But Graves was right about one thing. Fighting this with violence would only make things worse. He needed to be smart, needed to think like the courier he'd been during the war, finding paths through impossible situations. Lucas sat down at the table and forced himself to think clearly. Richard's case depended on documentation that was probably falsified, testimony from people who'd been paid or coerced, and a judge who'd been influenced by money or status or both. To fight it, Lucas needed to undermine that foundation, prove the documents were fake, discredit the witnesses, expose the judge's bias, all of which required resources he didn't have, unless he was willing to ask for help. Lucas had spent years avoiding connections, avoiding debts, avoiding anything that might make him beholden to another person. But Clara was worth swallowing his pride. She was worth anything. He pulled out the letter from Thomas Garrett that he'd never answered, the offer of work with the railroad. Garrett had influence. had connections, had access to lawyers and resources that could make a difference. And more than that, he owed Lucas. They'd saved each other's lives more times than either of them could count during the war. It was time to call in that debt. Lucas wrote quickly, explaining the situation in stark terms and asking for help. Legal help, financial help, whatever Garrett could provide. He sealed the letter and rode to town that same night, paying a rider double to deliver it to Cheyenne with all possible speed. Then he went to the boarding house where they were keeping Clara. Graves was standing guard outside her door, and he looked up wearily when Lucas approached. "You can't see her," he said. "Judge's orders." "I'm not here to see her," Lucas said. "I'm here to make you an offer." Graves raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "You know this whole thing stinks," Lucas said. "You know Richard fabricated half that evidence and pressured people into giving false testimony. You know Claire's innocent." "What I know and what I can prove are two different things," Graves said. "So help me prove it," Lucas said. "Give me access to the evidence. Tell me who the witnesses are. Let me investigate Richard's claims. If I'm wrong, if Clara really did steal that money with no justification, then I'll accept the verdict. But if I'm right, if you're right, it means I let a corrupt judge and a vindictive rich man pervert justice in my town," Graves said quietly, "which makes me complicit." "Which gives you a reason to help me fix it," Lucas said. Graves was quiet for a long time, his gaze distant. Then he sighed and jerked his head toward the stairs. "Come on, let's talk somewhere private." They went down to the empty saloon and sat in the back corner where no one could overhear. Graves pulled out a flask and took a long drink before passing it to Lucas. "The trial's set for 2 weeks from now," Graves said. "Pierce is bringing in a prosecutor from Laramie, and Richard's paying for it. They've got witnesses lined up. 4 servants from the Whitfield household, all swearing Clara was acting strange before she disappeared, plus the foreman Tully, who'll testify she refused his proposal and threatened to ruin the family if they didn't pay her money she claimed she was owed." "All lies," Lucas said. "Probably," Graves agreed. "But convincing lies, backed up by paperwork and delivered by people who look respectable. The jury's going to be local ranchers and business owners, and Richard's already working on them, buying drinks, making donations to the church, acting like the wrong party seeking justice." Lucas drank from the flask, letting the whiskey burn down his throat. "What about Clara? Does she get to defend herself?" "She can testify in her own defense, but without a lawyer, she's going up against a professional prosecutor who knows how to make innocent people look guilty. It won't be pretty." "Then we get her a lawyer," Lucas said. "With what money?" Graves asked bluntly. "A decent lawyer costs more than most people make in a year." "I have a friend who might help," Lucas said. "Former war buddy, works for the railroad now. I sent him a letter tonight." "Will he answer in time?" "He has to," Lucas said, because the alternative was unthinkable. Graves studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. I'll give you access to the evidence on the condition that you don't tamper with it or remove anything. And I'll tell you who the witnesses are, but you can't threaten them or try to influence their testimony. Anything you find, you bring to me first, and we figure out together how to use it. Deal?" Lucas shook his hand. "Deal." They spent the next hour going through the case file Graves had assembled. The documents were indeed compelling. Bank records showing a $200 withdrawal on the night Clara claimed to have left. Statements from servants describing Clara's erratic behavior and suspicious activities. Even a letter allegedly from Clara to her brother talking about getting what we're owed one way or another. "That letter's a forgery," Lucas said immediately. "Clara's brother was dead before she left the Whitfield house." Graves looked up sharply. "You're sure?" "Positive. She told me he died months before she ran. This letter is dated 2 weeks before she disappeared." "That's good," Graves said, making a note. "That's something we can use. What else?" Lucas studied the witness statements more carefully. 3 of the 4 servants had signed with X marks, claiming they couldn't write. The 4th signature was shaky and uncertain, like someone who wasn't used to holding a pen. "These people are illiterate, or close to it," Lucas said, "which means someone else wrote these statements and they just signed them, maybe without even understanding what they were signing." "Or maybe they were coerced," Graves said. "Richard has power over them. He could have threatened their jobs, their homes, their families. Can we prove that?" "Not easily," Graves admitted. But we can cast doubt on their credibility, especially if we can show the forged letter. It establishes a pattern of fabricated evidence. Lucas felt something like hope stirring in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. A thread to pull. A crack in Richard's carefully constructed case. "I need to see Clara, he said. Graves shook his head. "I told you, judge's orders." 5 minutes, Lucas interrupted. "I won't try to help her escape. I won't coach her testimony. I just need to see her. Make sure she's all right." Graves looked at him for a long moment, then sighed and stood up. 5 minutes. "And if Pierce finds out, I'm throwing you out of town myself." He led Lucas back to the boarding house and unlocked Clara's door. She was sitting on the narrow bed, still wearing her blue dress, staring at the wall with empty eyes. When she saw Lucas, something in her face crumbled and rebuilt itself in the span of a heartbeat. "I'll be right outside," Graves said, closing the door behind Lucas. Clara stood up, and Lucas crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. She clung to him like a drowning person, her face pressed against his chest, her whole body shaking. "I've got you," Lucas murmured. "I've got you." "I'm so scared," Clara whispered. "Lucas, I'm so scared." "I know. But we're going to fight this. I found something, the letter they claim you wrote to your brother. It's a forgery. Thomas was already dead when it was supposedly written." Clara pulled back to look at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "You can prove that?" "I can prove when Thomas died, which means I can prove Richard's willing to fabricate evidence. And if he fabricated one piece, the whole case falls apart." "What if it's not enough?" Clara asked. "What if they still convict me?" Lucas cupped her face in his hands. "Then I'll find another way. I'll appeal the verdict. I'll get you out. I'll burn down the whole damn territory if that's what it takes. You're not going to prison, Clara. I won't allow it." "You can't promise that," Clara said, but she was smiling through her tears. "Watch me," Lucas said, and kissed her like it was the last time, like he could pour all his love and determination and stubborn refusal to give up into that single moment. When Graves knocked on the door, Lucas pulled away reluctantly. 2 weeks, he said to Clara. "Hold on for 2 weeks, and I'll get you out of this." "I trust you," Clara said. Those 3 words sustained Lucas through the long ride back to the ranch, through the sleepless night that followed, through the grinding anxiety of waiting for Garrett's response. He worked like a man possessed, finishing the new rooms on the cabin, planting the garden Clara had planned, building the future they'd promised each other, even though he didn't know if they'd get to live in it. And he investigated. He rode to every neighboring ranch asking questions about Richard, about the case, about the witnesses. He learned that 2 of the servants had recently come into money. Not much, but more than they should have had. He learned that Marcus Tully was known as a violent drunk who'd been thrown out of 3 other jobs before the Whitfields hired him. He learned that Judge Pierce had business dealings with a bank that Richard's family partially owned. It was all circumstantial, nothing that would hold up in court by itself. But together, piece by piece, it painted a picture of corruption and conspiracy that even the most skeptical jury would have trouble ignoring. On the 10th day, Lucas got his answer from Garrett. The letter was brief and to the point. "Help is coming. Hold the line." 2 days later, a woman arrived at the ranch riding a bay mare and carrying a leather case that marked her as someone important. She was in her 40s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Hale?" she called out. Lucas walked out to meet her. "That's me. My name is Margaret Chen. Thomas Garrett retained me to represent your wife in her legal difficulties. I understand we have less than a week to prepare for trial." Lucas felt something in his chest loosen, just slightly. "You're a lawyer." "One of the best west of the Mississippi," Chen said without false modesty. "Now, shall we get started? Time is rather short, and I have a great deal of work to do." Margaret Chen worked like a woman possessed, and Lucas found himself both grateful for and slightly intimidated by her relentless efficiency. She set up operations in the cabin, spreading documents across the table Lucas and Clara had shared meals at, transforming their home into a war room with the same casual authority she seemed to bring to everything. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a notebook and a pencil. "Start from the moment Clara arrived at your ranch, and don't leave anything out. Every detail matters, Mr. Hale. Things you think are insignificant might be exactly what we need. Lucas told her. He described Clara's arrival, her refusal to leave, the way she'd worked herself into the fabric of his life without asking permission. He told her about the marriage, about Richard's arrival, about the forged letter, and the suspicious witness statements. Chen listened without interrupting, her pencil moving rapidly across the page, her expression revealing nothing. When he finished, she set down the pencil and looked at him with those sharp, assessing eyes. "You love her very much." It wasn't a question, but Lucas answered anyway. "More than anything." "Good," Chen said. "That will help. Juries respond to genuine emotion, and you won't have to fake yours. But Mr. Hale, I need you to understand something. This case is not going to be easy. Richard Whitfield has money, connections, and a carefully constructed narrative. He's had months to prepare, and we have less than a week. The odds are not in our favor." "I don't care about odds," Lucas said. "You should," Chen replied. "Because if we lose, your wife goes to prison for a crime she didn't commit, and there's very little we can do about it after the fact. Appeals in territorial courts are slow, expensive, and rarely successful, so we need to win this the first time, which means we need to be smart, aggressive, and absolutely meticulous in how we present our case." Lucas leaned forward. "Tell me what you need." "First, I need to speak with Clara. I need to hear her version of events directly, assess how she'll present on the stand, prepare her for cross-examination. Second, I need access to all the evidence the prosecution plans to use, every document, every witness statement, everything. Third, I need you to find me proof of Thomas's death, a burial record, a death certificate, testimony from someone who was there, something concrete that establishes the timeline and proves that letter is a forgery." "I can get you all of that," Lucas said. "Can you get it in 4 days?" Chen asked. Lucas met her eyes. "Yes." Chen studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then we have a chance. Not a guarantee, but a chance. That's more than most people get." She rode to town that afternoon to meet with Clara, and Lucas immediately set about tracking down proof of Thomas's death. He rode to the nearest town with a telegraph office and sent messages to Kansas, to the county clerk's office, to the church where Clara had said her brother was buried. He offered money he didn't have for expedited responses, promised favors he might not be able to deliver, and made it clear that this was a matter of life and death. While he waited for responses, he visited every ranch and settlement within 2 days' ride, asking about Richard, about Judge Pierce, about anything that might give them leverage. Most people were cautious, unwilling to speak against a wealthy man and a territorial judge. But Lucas had learned during the war that everyone had secrets, and if you asked the right questions of the right people, those secrets had a way of coming to light. It was a rancher's wife 3 hours south of town who finally gave him something useful. She was hanging laundry when Lucas rode up, and she eyed him warily until he explained why he was there. "You're asking about Edmund Pierce?" she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, even though they were alone. "Anything you can tell me," Lucas said. The woman glanced back at her house, then stepped closer to the fence. "My husband had a land dispute 2 years back. Neighbor claimed our creek was on his property, wanted us to pay for water rights. Case went before Judge Pierce." She paused, her hands twisting in her apron. "Pierce ruled in the neighbor's favor even though we had clear documentation showing the creek was ours. We lost half our water access and nearly went under that winter." "I'm sorry," Lucas said, "but I don't see how—" "The neighbor sold his land 6 months later," the woman interrupted, "to a holding company owned by Pierce's brother-in-law. They got our water rights in the sale. My husband tried to fight it, but the lawyers told him it would cost more than we could afford, and we'd probably lose anyway." Lucas felt something cold and sharp settle in his gut. Pierce profited from his own ruling. "More or less," the woman said. "We could never prove the connection, but everyone knew. Everyone knows Pierce is for sale if you have enough money and the right connections." "Would you testify to that?" Lucas asked. The woman's face went pale. "I can't. If Pierce found out I spoke against him, he could ruin us. He's got friends in the territorial government, friends in the land office. He could take everything we have left." "Ma'am, a woman's life is on the line," Lucas said gently. "My wife's life. She's innocent, and Pierce is helping Richard Whitfield convict her of a crime she didn't commit. I understand you're scared, but please, If you know anything that could help, anything that could prove Pierce is corrupt. I told you what I know, the woman said, backing away. I'm sorry about your wife, truly I am, but I can't risk my family for a stranger. Lucas wanted to argue, wanted to press harder, but he could see the fear in her eyes and knew it wouldn't help. He thanked her and rode away, his mind already working on how to use what she'd told him without putting her at risk. The telegraph responses started arriving on the third day. The county clerk in Kansas confirmed that a Thomas Whitfield, age 19, had died of fever on April 12th, 5 months before the date on the forged letter. The church sent a copy of the burial record showing Thomas had been laid to rest in the church cemetery with Clara Whitfield listed as next of kin. It was exactly what they needed, concrete documented proof that the letter was a fabrication. Lucas brought the documents to Chen, who examined them with the critical eye of someone who'd seen too many forgeries to take anything at face value. But after several minutes of scrutiny, she nodded with satisfaction. This is good, she said. Very good. With this, we can prove Richard is willing to manufacture evidence, which calls into question everything else he's presented. Is it enough to win? Lucas asked. It's enough to create reasonable doubt, Chen said, which in a criminal trial is all we need. But Mr. Hale, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that it might not be enough. Juries are unpredictable, and Richard is very good at playing the sympathetic victim. Lucas had seen Richard exactly once since Clara's arrest, passing on the street in town, their eyes meeting for a brief, hate-filled moment before Richard had smiled and tipped his hat like they were old friends. The casual cruelty of it had made Lucas want to put his fist through something, preferably Richard's face. What about Pierce? Lucas asked. I found someone who says he's corrupt, that he profits from his own rulings. Can we use that? Chen's expression sharpened. Tell me everything. Lucas relayed what the rancher's wife had told him, and Chen listened with growing interest. When he finished, she sat back and tapped her pencil against her notebook. It's not enough to disqualify him from this case, she said, but it might be enough to make him nervous, to make him think twice about how overtly he helps Richard. If Pierce thinks we're investigating his conduct, he'll be more careful about showing bias. So what do? We let him know we know, Chen said. Subtly, in court, when appropriate. A carefully worded question, a pointed comment about conflicts of interest. Nothing actionable, nothing that crosses the line into contempt, but enough to put him on notice that we're watching. The day before the trial, Chen finally let Lucas visit Clara. They met in the boarding house room under Graves's watchful supervision, and Lucas was shocked by how much Clara had changed in 2 weeks. She'd lost weight, her face hollow and drawn, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear. But when she saw him, she smiled, and that smile was pure Clara, stubborn and brave and refusing to break. You look terrible, she said, reaching for his hands. So do you, Lucas replied, and they both laughed, sharp and slightly hysterical. Mrs. Chen says we have a good case, Clara said. She says the forged letter changes everything. It helps, Lucas said carefully. But Clara, you need to understand that nothing's guaranteed. Richard has resources, he has influence, and he's been planning this for months. I know, Clara said quietly. Mrs. Chen explained it all. She's very thorough. She's the best, Lucas said. Garrett wouldn't have sent her if she wasn't. Clara looked down at their joined hands. I've been thinking about what happens if we lose. We're not going to lose. But if we do, Clara persisted. If they convict me and send me to prison, Lucas, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll move on, Clara said, her voice breaking. Promise me you won't spend the rest of your life waiting for me or trying to fix something that can't be fixed. Promise me you'll find someone else, someone who can give you the future we planned. No, Lucas said flatly. Absolutely not. Lucas, there is no one else, Lucas said, gripping her hands tighter. There's never going to be anyone else. You're it for me, Clara. You're the only future I want, and if they take you away from me, I'll spend every day I have left fighting to get you back. That's not negotiable. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. That's not fair to you. I don't care about fair, Lucas said. I care about you. So stop talking about moving on because it's not happening. We're going to win this trial, and then we're going back to our ranch, and we're going to build the life we promised each other. That's how this ends." "Time's up," Graves said from the doorway, his voice gentle. Lucas stood and pulled Clara into his arms, holding her as tightly as he dared. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "Tomorrow, you get on that stand and you tell the truth, and you let Chen do the rest. Can you do that?" Clara nodded against his chest. "I can do that." "Good girl," Lucas said, and kissed her forehead before forcing himself to let go. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the bed they'd shared and stared at the ceiling and went over every detail of the case in his mind, looking for weaknesses, for opportunities, for anything they might have missed. When dawn finally came, he dressed in his best clothes, the black vest and clean shirt from their wedding, and rode to town with his stomach in knots. The courthouse was packed. Word had spread about the trial, and it seemed like everyone in the territory had shown up to watch. Lucas pushed through the crowd and found a seat near the front, close enough to see Clara when they brought her in. She appeared a few minutes later, flanked by deputies wearing her blue wedding dress again. Chen had insisted on it, said it made Clara look innocent and sympathetic, reminded the jury she was a wife, not a criminal. Clara's eyes found Lucas immediately, and he gave her the smallest nod, trying to pour all his confidence and love into that single gesture. Judge Pierce entered, and everyone stood. He looked exactly like what he was, a small man with delusions of importance, drunk on the tiny bit of power the territory had given him. He called the court to order, and the prosecutor stood to give his opening statement. The prosecutor was good, Lucas had to admit. He painted Clara as a conniving woman who'd ingratiated herself with a kind family, stolen from them, and then fled when confronted with her crime. He showed the jury the bank records, the witness statements, the forged letter that he claimed proved Clara had been planning her theft for months. He made her sound calculating and cold, a woman who'd betrayed the trust of people who'd treated her like family. It was all lies, but it was convincing lies, delivered with practiced sincerity. Then it was Chen's turn. She stood slowly, buttoning her jacket with precise, deliberate movements, and walked to stand directly in front of the jury. For a long moment, she just looked at them, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "The prosecutor just told you a story," she said finally, "a neat, tidy story about a wicked woman and her innocent victims. But like all stories, it depends on you believing the narrator, and I'm here to tell you that the narrator in this case is a liar." Richard half rose from his seat, but Pierce waved him down with an irritated gesture. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Clara Hale is a thief," Chen continued. "They want you to believe she stole $200 from the family that employed her. But here's what they're not telling you. Clara Hale worked for the Whitfield family for 8 years. 8 years of 16-hour days, of caring for a dying woman, of running a household. And in those 8 years, do you know how much she was paid?" Chen paused, letting the question hang in the air. "Nothing," she said. "Not 1 cent in wages. The Whitfields claimed they were paying her in room and board, that she should be grateful for their generosity. But when Clara asked for her wages, the money she'd earned through years of labor, they told her there was no money. That she'd never been an employee at all, just charity they'd been kind enough to extend." The jury was listening now, really listening. Lucas could see some of them shifting in their seats, frowning. "So Clara took $200, Chen said. Took it from the household account the night she left. Was that theft? Or was it a woman claiming the wages she'd earned and been denied? That's the question you need to answer. But before you do, I want you to ask yourself why Richard Whitfield is really here. Is it because he wants justice? Or is it because a woman dared to stand up to him, dared to take what was rightfully hers, and he can't stand the thought of her getting away with it?" She let that sink in, then returned to her seat. The prosecutor looked less confident than he had a moment ago, and Richard's face had gone red with barely contained fury. Pierce called the first witness, one of the Whitfield servants, a nervous woman in her 50s who could barely look at Clara. She testified that Clara had been acting strangely before she disappeared, that she'd been secretive and jumpy, that she'd asked odd questions about the household finances. Chen's cross-examination was surgical. "Mrs. Palmer, how long did you work for the Whitfield family?" Chen asked. 12 years, ma'am," the woman said. And in those 12 years, did you ever receive regular wages? The woman hesitated. I received room and board. That wasn't my question, Chen said gently. Did you receive wages? Money you could save or spend as you chose? Well, no, but Mr. Whitfield always said, Thank you, Chen interrupted. Now, this statement you signed describing Clara's behavior, did you write it yourself? No, ma'am, I can't write much more than my name. So someone else wrote it for you and you signed it? Yes, ma'am. Who wrote it? The woman looked at Richard, then quickly away. Mr. Whitfield's secretary, I believe. Did you read the statement before you signed it? Another hesitation. The secretary read it to me. But you didn't read it yourself. No, ma'am. Chen nodded. So you have no way of knowing if what you signed accurately reflects what you actually told the secretary, do you? I suppose not, the woman admitted. Chen excused the witness, and Lucas could see the jury's skepticism growing. The pattern repeated with the next two servants, illiterate or barely literate women who'd signed statements they hadn't read, statements that had been carefully crafted to make Clara look guilty. Then the prosecutor called Marcus Tully. Tully was exactly as Clara had described him, middle-aged, rough-looking, with the broken blood vessels in his nose that marked a heavy drinker. He swaggered to the stand like he owned it, and when he was sworn in, he grinned at Richard like they were sharing a private joke. Mr. Tully, the prosecutor said, how long did you work for the Whitfield family? Going on 6 years now, Tully said. And what was your relationship with the defendant? Tully's grin widened. Well, I was sweet on her, asked her to marry me, in fact. Thought we could make a good life together. And what was her response? She turned me down flat, Tully said. Said she'd rather die alone than marry me. Then she started making threats. What kind of threats? Said the family owed her money, that she'd been working for nothing all those years, and she aimed to get what was coming to her one way or another. Said if they didn't pay up, she'd find a way to take it herself. It was a damning testimony, and Lucas could see some of the jurors nodding, their expressions hardening. But Chen just sat there, perfectly calm, making notes on her pad. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached Tully with the same pleasant expression she'd given the other witnesses. Mr. Tully, you said you asked Clara to marry you. When was this? About 2 months before she disappeared, Tully said. And you were how old at the time? Tully's eyes narrowed. I don't see what that has to do with... Please answer the question, Chen said. 43. And Clara was 19, Chen said. Does it strike you as unusual that a 19-year-old woman might not want to marry a man 24 years her senior? Plenty of women marry older men, Tully said defensively. Indeed they do, Chen agreed, but usually by choice, not because their employer is pressuring them. Tell me, Mr. Tully, did Richard Whitfield ask you to propose to Clara? Tully's face went red. That's not... It's a simple question, Mr. Tully. Did Richard Whitfield suggest that you marry Clara? He might have mentioned it was a good idea, Tully muttered. Did he offer you any incentive to marry her? I don't know what you mean. Did he promise you land, or a higher position, or more pay if you married Clara Whitfield? Chen's voice was still pleasant, but there was steel underneath it. Tully looked at Richard, then at the judge. I want to answer on the grounds that it might incriminate me. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Pierce banged his gavel for order, and Chen smiled coldly. No further questions, she said. The prosecutor tried to recover with redirect questioning, but the damage was done. Tully looked like a man who'd been caught in a trap, and the jury knew it. Richard was called next, and he took the stand with the confidence of a man who'd never been seriously challenged in his life. He told his version of events smoothly, painting himself as the concerned brother-in-law trying to recover stolen property, Clara as the ungrateful servant who'd betrayed his family's kindness. Mr. Whitfield, Chen said when it was her turn, you've testified that your family employed Clara for 8 years. Did you pay her wages during that time? We provided room and board, Richard said. That was the agreement. Was there a written contract specifying this arrangement? No, it was a verbal agreement. With whom? Richard hesitated. With Clara, obviously. Clara was 14 when she came to work for you, Chen said. Are you telling this court that you made a legally binding employment agreement with a 14-year-old child? It wasn't like that, Richard said, his smooth demeanor cracking slightly. She came to us as charity, and we were kind enough to give her work. So she wasn't an employee, she was charity, Chen said. Yet you're prosecuting her for theft from an employer. Which is it, Mr. Whitfield? Was she an employee who owed you loyalty, or was she charity who owed you nothing? Richard's jaw tightened. She stole from us. That's all that matters. Did she? Chen walked to her table and picked up a document. This is a burial record from Kansas showing that Thomas Whitfield died on April 12th. Your Honor, I'd like to enter this as Defense Exhibit A. Pierce nodded, and Chen handed the document to the clerk before turning back to Richard. Mr. Whitfield, when did Thomas die? I don't recall the exact date, Richard said carefully. Was it before or after Clara left your employment? Before, I believe. 5 months before, according to this record, Chen said. She picked up another document, the forged letter. Yet this letter, which you submitted as evidence, is allegedly from Clara to her brother Thomas, dated 2 weeks before she disappeared. Can you explain how Clara wrote a letter to her brother 2 weeks after he died? The courtroom went dead silent. Richard's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. There must be some mistake in the dates. There's no mistake, Chen said. The record is clear. Thomas Whitfield died in April. This letter is dated in September, which means this letter is a forgery, doesn't it, Mr. Whitfield? I didn't forge anything, Richard said, his voice rising. Someone else must have, maybe Clara herself, trying to... Why would Clara forge a letter to her dead brother and then submit it as evidence against herself? Chen asked. That makes no sense, Mr. Whitfield, unless you're suggesting she's not just a thief, but also deeply irrational. I don't know what she did or why, Richard snapped. All I know is that money was stolen and Clara took it. Did she steal it? Chen asked. Or did she take wages she'd earned and been denied? Wages for 8 years of labor, 16 hours a day, caring for your dying mother while you and your family lived in comfort, built on her unpaid work? Objection, the prosecutor shouted. Argumentative. Sustained, Pierce said, but he looked uncomfortable. Chen smiled. No further questions. The prosecution rested its case, and Pierce called for a recess. Lucas watched Richard storm out of the courtroom, his face twisted with rage, and felt a savage satisfaction. Chen had torn his testimony apart, exposed the forged letter, cast doubt on every piece of evidence he'd presented. But it wasn't over yet. When court reconvened, Chen called Clara to the stand. Lucas watched her walk up there with her head high, her hands steady despite what he knew must be overwhelming fear. She was sworn in, and Chen began with gentle, establishing questions. Her name, her history, how she'd come to work for the Whitfield family. Then Chen asked her about Thomas. Clara's composure cracked just slightly when she talked about her brother, the way her voice wavered when she described his death, the tears that filled her eyes when she explained how she'd used her savings to pay for his burial. Lucas saw several jurors look away, uncomfortable with the raw grief on display. Clara, Chen said gently, did you steal $200 from the Whitfield family? No, Clara said firmly. I took wages I'd earned. Wages they refused to pay me. Did you ask them for your wages before you took the money? Yes, multiple times. Richard told me I'd never been an employee, that I'd been charity, that I should be grateful for what they'd given me. What did you plan to do with the money? Start over, Clara said. Find somewhere I could work for real wages. Somewhere I could build a life that was mine. I'd spent 8 years working for nothing, watching Mrs. Whitfield die by inches while her family treated me like furniture. I just wanted to be free. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to trip Clara up, to make her seem calculating or vengeful, to suggest she'd always planned to steal the money. But Clara held firm, answering every question with quiet dignity, never losing her temper even when the prosecutor's questions became cruel. When it was finally over, when Clara stepped down from the stand and returned to the defense table, Lucas could see she was shaking. But she'd done it. She'd told her truth, and she'd made the jury see her as a person, not a criminal. Chen called two more witnesses, a doctor from Kansas who testified about the poverty wages common for household servants, and a legal expert who explained that verbal employment contracts with minors weren't enforceable. Then she rested her case. Closing arguments took another hour. The prosecutor stuck to his story, but it sounded hollow now, undermined by the forged letter and the exposed contradictions in Richard's testimony. Chen was devastating, weaving together every thread of evidence into a narrative of exploitation and injustice, of a young woman taking the only option left to her after years of abuse. Clara Hale is not a thief, Chen said, looking each juror in the eye. She's a survivor. And if you convict her, you're not delivering justice. You're helping a powerful man punish a woman for daring to stand up to him. I trust you're better than that. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Lucas spent that time pacing the courthouse steps, unable to sit still, barely able to breathe. Clara sat with Chen inside, her face pale but composed, and Lucas knew she was preparing herself for the worst. When the jury finally returned, Lucas pushed his way back into the courtroom and found his seat. The foreman stood, a middle-aged rancher with weathered hands and a face that revealed nothing. "Have you reached a verdict?" Pierce asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman said. "On the charge of theft, how do you find?" The foreman looked at Clara, and for one horrible moment, Lucas thought he saw condemnation in that gaze. Then the man spoke, clear and firm. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Lucas felt his knees go weak, felt tears burning in his eyes. Clara's face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands while Chen put a steady arm around her shoulders. Richard was shouting something, demanding a retrial, insisting the jury had been manipulated, but Pierce gavelled him into silence with obvious irritation. "The defendant is acquitted," Pierce said. "She's free to go." Lucas pushed through the crowd and Clara met him halfway, throwing herself into his arms with such force she nearly knocked him over. He held her tight, feeling her sob against his chest, feeling his own tears mixing with hers. "It's over," he said into her hair. "It's over. You're free. It's over." "I was so scared," Clara gasped. "Lucas, I was so scared." "I know, but you're safe now. You're safe and you're mine, and nobody's ever taking you away from me again." Chen appeared beside them, her normally stern expression softened by something that might have been satisfaction. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hale. Justice prevailed today." Clara pulled back from Lucas just enough to grab Chen's hand. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know how to—" "No thanks necessary," Chen said. "Just live a good life. That's payment enough." They walked out of the courthouse together into the late afternoon sun, and Lucas felt like he could finally breathe again. The nightmare was over. Clara was free. They could go home. But as they reached their horses, Lucas saw Richard standing across the street, watching them with an expression of such pure hatred that it sent a chill down his spine. Richard caught his eye and smiled, cold and cruel, and Lucas knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't really over. Richard Whitfield wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. He was the kind of man who waited for his moment and struck when you least expected it. Lucas put his arm around Clara and steered her toward their horses, keeping himself between her and Richard, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. They mounted up and rode out of town without looking back, but Lucas could feel Richard's eyes on them the whole way, could feel the weight of unfinished business pressing down on his shoulders. "He's not going to let this go, is he?" Clara said quietly as they left the town behind. "No," Lucas admitted. "He's not." "What do we do?" Lucas looked at his wife, his brave, stubborn, impossible wife who'd walked into his life and refused to leave even when leaving would have been easier, and made a decision. "We go home," he said. "We build our life. And if Richard comes for us again, we'll be ready." Clara nodded, sitting straighter in her saddle. "Together." "Together," Lucas agreed. They rode toward the ranch as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Behind them, the town faded into distance. Ahead of them, their home waited, the cabin they'd built together, the garden Clara had planned, the future they'd fought so hard to protect. It wasn't perfect. The threat of Richard still hung over them like a storm cloud on the horizon. But they were together, they were free, and that was enough. For now, that was enough. The ranch felt different when they returned to it that evening. like the land itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Clara dismounted slowly, her legs shaky from exhaustion and relief, and stood in the yard looking at the cabin with eyes that seemed to be seeing it for the first time. "I didn't think I'd ever come back here," she said softly. Lucas came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. "You're home now. That's all that matters." But even as he said it, Lucas couldn't shake the image of Richard's face, that cold smile that promised retribution. He'd seen that look before during the war, on the faces of men who would rather burn everything down than accept defeat. It was the look of someone dangerous, someone unpredictable, someone who wouldn't stop until they'd destroyed what they couldn't control. They spent the next week trying to settle back into normalcy. Clara threw herself into the garden with renewed determination, planting the seeds she'd bought before the trial, working the soil until her hands were raw and blistered. Lucas finished the new rooms on the cabin, framing in the east-facing windows Clara had wanted, building shelves for the books she planned to collect, creating space for the family they both hoped would come. At night they held each other close, and sometimes Clara would wake gasping from nightmares about prison cells and verdicts that went the other way. Lucas would talk her back to calm, reminding her it was over, she was safe, they'd won. But he noticed she'd started checking the road more often, her eyes scanning the horizon like she expected to see riders approaching at any moment. She wasn't wrong to be worried. The warning came from an unexpected source. John Graves rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning, his face grim, and Lucas knew before the lawman even opened his mouth that the news was bad. "Richards filed a civil suit," Graves said without preamble, "claiming damages for emotional distress and loss of property. He's asking for $500 plus court costs." Lucas felt his jaw tighten. The jury found Clara innocent. "The jury found her not guilty of criminal theft," Graves corrected. "Civil court has a lower burden of proof. Richard doesn't need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Clara stole from him. He just needs to convince a judge that it's more likely than not. And he's got Judge Pierce hearing the case." "Of course he does," Lucas said bitterly. "Can we challenge it? Get a different judge?" "You can try, but it'll cost money you probably don't have, and there's no guarantee it'll work. Pierce has jurisdiction over civil disputes in this territory." Clara had come out of the cabin when she heard the horse, and now she stood on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself. "What happens if we lose?" she asked. "Pierce issues a judgment against you for the full amount," Graves said. "If you can't pay, he can seize property to settle the debt. Your land, your livestock, everything you own." "He's trying to take the ranch," Clara said flatly. "That's what this is really about." "Probably," Graves agreed. "I'm sorry. I wish I had better news." After Graves left, Lucas and Clara sat at the table in silence, the weight of this new threat settling over them like a shroud. They'd survived the criminal trial, had fought so hard for their freedom, and now Richard was coming at them from a different angle, using the law as a weapon to destroy them piece by piece. "We could sell," Clara said finally. "Take what we can get for the ranch and leave. Start over somewhere else, somewhere Richard can't find us." "No," Lucas said immediately. "We're not running. This is our home. We built it together, and we're keeping it." "Then what do we do?" Clara's voice was calm, but Lucas could hear the exhaustion underneath it, the weariness of someone who'd been fighting too long. Lucas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land they'd worked so hard to build a life on. The fence lines he'd ridden 100 times, the barn where Clara had slept those first nights, the garden plot she'd marked out with such careful optimism. Every inch of this place held their history, their sweat, their dreams. "We fight," he said. "Whatever it takes, we fight." But fighting required resources they didn't have. Margaret Chen had returned to Cheyenne, her work done, and Lucas doubted Thomas Garrett would be willing to fund another legal battle so soon. They had no money for lawyers, no connections to judges who might rule fairly, no leverage except the truth and their stubborn refusal to surrender. It didn't feel like enough. The civil hearing was set for 3 weeks out, and Lucas spent those weeks preparing in the only way he knew how, by gathering every scrap of evidence he could find, by talking to anyone who might testify on Clara's behalf, by building a case brick by brick, even though he knew the odds were stacked against them. He rode back to Kansas, spending money they couldn't afford on a trip that might yield nothing. But he needed to see the Whitfield house for himself, needed to talk to people who'd known Clara during those 8 years, needed to find something, anything, that would prove Richard was lying about who his sister-in-law really was. What he found was a house full of servants who were too scared to speak against their employer, neighbors who barely remembered Clara, and a foreman named Marcus Tully who threatened to have Lucas arrested for trespassing if he didn't leave immediately. But he also found something else, something he almost missed. In the church where Thomas was buried, Lucas met an elderly priest who'd known Clara and her brother. The man was half-blind and nearly deaf, but his memory was sharp, and when Lucas explained why he was there, the priest's weathered face creased with concern. Clara was a good girl, the priest said. She and young Thomas, they came to Mass every Sunday without fail. Even when Mrs. Whitfield was at her worst, Clara would finish her duties and walk 2 miles to make sure Thomas got to church. "Do you remember when Thomas died, Bussy?" Lucas asked. "Of course. April of last year. Terrible thing, fever took him in just days." Clara was devastated. She'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to save him, spent every penny she had on doctors and medicine. "Did you know the Whitfield family?" The priest's expression darkened. "I knew of them. Richard came to church occasionally, always sat in the front pew like he owned the place. Never saw him lift a finger to help anyone, though he was quick enough to lecture others about Christian charity." "Would you be willing to testify about Clara's character?" Lucas asked. "About the kind of person she was?" The priest studied him for a long moment. "You're her husband." "I am." "She found someone good then? Someone who fights for her?" The priest nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll testify. The truth should be told, even if powerful men don't want to hear it." Lucas rode back to Wyoming with the priest's written statement and a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't much, but it was something. Proof that Clara had been exactly who she claimed to be, a devoted sister and a hard worker. Not the conniving thief Richard painted her as. When he got back to the ranch, he found Clara in the garden, her hands working the soil with mechanical efficiency. She looked up when she heard his horse, and Lucas saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. "Did you find anything?" "I found a priest who remembers you and Thomas," Lucas said, dismounting. "He's willing to testify about your character, about how you cared for your brother." Clara's hands stilled in the dirt. "Will it be enough?" "I don't know," Lucas admitted, "but it's more than we had before." She stood slowly, brushing the soil from her hands, and walked to where he stood. "Lucas, I need to tell you something." The serious tone in her voice made Lucas's stomach tighten. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," Clara said. The world seemed to stop. Lucas stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words, and Clara watched him with an expression caught between hope and fear. "You're sure?" he finally managed. "I've missed 2 months," Claire said, "and I've been sick every morning for the past week. I'm sure." Lucas felt something enormous swell in his chest, joy and terror in equal measure. A child. They were going to have a child. In the middle of this nightmare with Richard, with the civil suit threatening to take everything they had, Clara was carrying his baby. "Are you angry?" Clara asked quietly. "Angry?" Lucas pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, like she might break. "I'm terrified and thrilled and I don't know what I am, but I'm not angry. Never angry." Clara sagged against him in relief. "I didn't know how to tell you. With everything that's happening, it feels like the worst possible timing." "Or the best," Lucas said into her hair. "We're building a future, Clara. That's what this is. Whatever Richard tries to take from us, he can't take this." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the garden Clara had planted with such hope, and Lucas made a silent promise to the child growing inside his wife. He would protect them both, would fight with everything he had to give his family the life they deserved. Richard Whitfield could throw lawyers and lawsuits and all his money at them, but he couldn't break something built on love and stubbornness and sheer refusal to surrender. The civil hearing arrived too quickly. Lucas and Clara rode to town together, Clara wearing the blue dress that had become her armor, Lucas in his black vest and cleanest shirt. They'd decided not to mention the pregnancy. It was too private, too precious to be used as a bargaining chip or a plea for sympathy. The hearing was held in the same courtroom where Clara had been tried for theft, but the atmosphere was different. There was no jury this time, just Judge Pierce sitting behind his bench with an expression of barely concealed irritation, like he resented having to waste his time on this matter, even though he'd probably agreed to hear it as a favor to Richard. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table with a new lawyer, an older man with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that screamed money. Lucas and Clara sat alone at the defense table, and the disparity between them couldn't have been more obvious. Pierce called the hearing to order, and Richard's lawyer began his case. He presented the same documents as before, the bank records, the witness statements, the now discredited forged letter that he tried to argue was still relevant despite the criminal jury's verdict. He called Marcus Tully again, who repeated his testimony about Clara's threats and erratic behavior. When it was Lucas's turn to respond, he stood with the priest's statement in his hand and no real idea how to present it effectively. He wasn't a lawyer, didn't know the right words or the proper procedures. He just told the truth about Clara's years of unpaid labor, about her devotion to her brother, about the impossible situation Richard had put her in. He called the priest, who'd made the journey from Kansas at his own expense, and the old man testified with quiet conviction about Clara's character, about her kindness and her strength. But Lucas could see it wasn't working. Pierce's expression never changed, never softened. He asked no questions, made no comments, just sat there like he was waiting for this tiresome business to be over, so he could issue the verdict he'd probably already decided on. When both sides had finished presenting their cases, Pierce didn't even pretend to deliberate. He shuffled some papers, made a few notes, and looked up with the air of a man completing an unpleasant but necessary task. "I find in favor of the plaintiff," he said. "Mrs. Hale is ordered to pay Mr. Whitfield $500 in damages plus court costs within 30 days. Failure to pay will result in seizure of property to satisfy the judgment." Clara made a small sound beside Lucas, like she'd been struck. Lucas felt fury rise in his throat, hot and choking, but he forced it down. Losing his temper wouldn't help. Nothing would help now except finding $500 they didn't have. They left the courthouse in silence, and Lucas was so focused on Clara, on the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will, that he almost didn't notice the man waiting by their horses. Thomas Garrett looked exactly as Lucas remembered him, tall and broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He was leaning against the hitching post with the casual patience of someone who had all the time in the world. "Heard you had some trouble," Garrett said by way of greeting. Lucas felt something loosen in his chest. "Thomas? What are you doing here?" "Margaret Chen sent me a telegram after the criminal trial," Garrett said. "Said you'd won, but that Whitfield wasn't the type to let things go. Figured I should check in, see if you needed help." He looked at Clara. "You must be the woman who finally got Lucas to settle down. I'm Thomas Garrett." "Clara Hale," she said, shaking his hand. "Your lawyer saved my life." "Margaret's good at that," Garrett agreed. He turned back to Lucas. "I heard about the civil judgment. $500 is a lot of money." "Money we don't have," Lucas said flatly. "I figured as much." Garrett reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. "Consider this a loan. No interest. Pay me back when you can. Or don't. I owe you more than money can repay anyway." He held out a stack of bills, and Lucas stared at it like it might bite him. "Thomas, I can't." "Yes, you can," Garrett said firmly. "You saved my life at least 3 times during the war, probably more that I've forgotten. You carried me on your back for 5 miles after I took a bullet in the leg at Bull Run. You talked me out of deserting when I thought I couldn't take another day of it. So yes, Lucas, you can take this money, and you can pay off Whitfield, and you can stop being so goddamn proud about accepting help from people who care about you." Lucas looked at Clara, who nodded slightly, and then back at the money in Garrett's hand. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to find another way, to not be indebted to anyone. But those instincts had nearly cost him Clara once already, and he wasn't making that mistake again. "Thank you," he said, taking the money. "I'll pay you back." "I know you will," Garrett said. "Now let's go find Whitfield and settle this thing once and for all." They found Richard at the hotel, celebrating his victory with expensive whiskey and the self-satisfied smirk of a man who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. His expression soured when he saw Lucas walk in, and it turned to genuine shock when Lucas dropped the $500 on the table in front of him. "There's your blood money," Lucas said. "We're settled. You got your judgment, you got your payment, and now you're done with us. Permanently." Richard looked at the money, then at Lucas, then at Garrett standing behind Lucas like a wall of silent support. "Where did you get this?" "That's none of your concern," Lucas said. "The debt is paid. We're clear." "For now," Richard said, leaning back in his chair. "But civil court has no statute of limitations on filing new claims. I could come after you again next year, or the year after that. I could make this a regular occurrence, bleeding you dry a little bit at a time until there's nothing left." Garrett stepped forward, and even though he didn't touch Richard, the threat in his movement was unmistakable. "You could try," Garrett said quietly, "but I wouldn't recommend it." "Who are you?" Richard demanded. "Someone with friends in the territorial government," Garrett said. "Friends who might be very interested to hear about a judge who profits from his own rulings, about cases where he ruled in favor of his brother-in-law's business interests, about a pattern of corruption that goes back years." Richard's face went pale. "You can't prove that." "Can I?" Garrett smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. "I've already got affidavits from 3 different ranchers who lost cases before Pierce and then mysteriously lost their land to companies Pierce's family had connections to. I've got bank records showing large deposits into Pierce's account around the same time as controversial rulings, and I've got a friend at the territorial newspaper who's very interested in running a story about it." "You're bluffing," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Try me," Garrett said. "File another lawsuit against the Hales, and I'll make sure every newspaper from here to Washington knows exactly what kind of man you are. I'll expose your fabricated evidence, your bought witnesses, your corrupt judge. And when I'm done, you won't be able to show your face in polite society without people whispering about what a petty, vindictive little man you are." Richard's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "You have no idea who you're threatening." "Actually, I do," Garrett said. "You're a small-time tyrant who's used to getting his way, because nobody's had the resources to stand up to you before. But that changes now. Leave the Hales alone, or I'll make destroying your reputation my personal hobby, your choice." For a long moment, nobody moved. Lucas watched Richard's face cycle through anger, fear, calculation, and finally grudging acceptance. Richard was a bully, but he wasn't stupid. He knew when he was beaten. "Fine," Richard said finally. "We're settled. I have no further business with Mrs. Hale." "Put it in writing," Garrett said, pulling out a piece of paper and a pen. "Right now. Witnessed and signed." Richard's jaw worked, but he took the pen and wrote out a brief statement acknowledging receipt of the $500 and renouncing any further claims against Clara Hale. Garrett read it carefully, then folded it and put it in his pocket. "Pleasure doing business with you," Garrett said, and turned to leave. Lucas and Clara followed, and they were almost to the door when Richard called out. "She'll never really be free, you know," Richard said. "Even if I leave her alone, there will always be people like me. People who see someone rising above their station and want to push them back down. She'll spend her whole life fighting that." Lucas turned back and met Richard's eyes. "Then we'll spend our whole lives fighting," he said simply. "And we'll win, every single time. Because she's stronger than you, and she's got me, and together we're stronger than anything you could ever throw at us." Richard had no answer to that. Lucas took Clara's hand and walked out of the hotel into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Is it really over?" Clara asked quietly. "It's really over," Lucas said. They rode back to the ranch with Garrett following, and spent the evening around the dinner table talking about the war, about the railroad, about everything except the ordeal they'd just survived. Garrett stayed in the barn that night, insisting he didn't want to impose, and in the morning he shook Lucas's hand and hugged Clara goodbye. "You two take care of each other," he said. "And Lucas, write to me once in a while. Let me know how you're doing." "I will," Lucas promised. After Garrett left, Lucas and Clara stood in the yard and looked at their ranch. The cabin with its new rooms, the garden starting to show green shoots, the fence lines stretching out toward the horizon. It was modest and rough and still unfinished in 100 small ways, but it was theirs, really, truly theirs now. "What do we do now?" Clara asked. "Now?" Lucas pulled her close, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Now we live. We plant the garden. We finish the house. We get ready for this baby. We do all the ordinary, boring, beautiful things we fought so hard to be able to do." Clara smiled up at him. "That sounds perfect." The weeks that followed were the best of Lucas's life. Spring deepened into summer, and the garden Clara had planted with such determination burst into abundance. They spent long days working the land together, Clara's belly slowly rounding as the baby grew, Lucas building and planning and preparing for the expansion of their family. They talked about names, Rose for a girl, Thomas for a boy. They talked about adding more rooms to the house, about buying more cattle, about all the small dreams that made up a life. And sometimes, late at night, they talked about the trial and everything they'd survived. But those conversations became less frequent as the memories lost their sharp edges and faded into the past. Clara's pregnancy progressed smoothly, despite her fears. She worked in the garden until she couldn't bend over anymore, then switched to mending and cooking and all the indoor tasks that kept a household running. Lucas hovered, worried about her overdoing it, until she finally laughed and told him she was pregnant, not dying. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she said, patting her swollen belly. "I think I can manage." But when the time came, when Clara's water broke during a thunderstorm in late July, and the contractions started coming hard and fast, Lucas discovered that knowing women had babies and watching his wife go through it were two very different things. He rode through the storm to fetch the midwife from town, nearly getting thrown from his horse when lightning struck too close, and by the time they made it back to the ranch, Clara was in the final stages of labor. She was on the bed, her face pale and slick with sweat, her hands gripping the sheets hard enough to tear them. The midwife took over with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times, and Lucas was relegated to the sidelines, useless and terrified. He held Clara's hand when she let him, brought water when the midwife asked for it, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of Clara's pain, of her screams that tore at Lucas's heart, of the midwife's steady instructions and Clara's exhausted determination. The storm raged outside, thunder shaking the cabin's walls, and Lucas thought he'd never been so scared in his life, not even during the war. Then just as the storm began to break, just as the thunder started to fade and the rain softened to a gentle patter, the baby came. The midwife caught the tiny, squalling thing and held it up, and Lucas saw through his tears that they had a daughter. She was red-faced and furious, her fists waving, her lungs clearly working just fine. "A girl," the midwife said, smiling, "healthy and strong." Clara was crying, reaching for the baby with trembling hands, and the midwife cleaned the infant quickly and placed her in Clara's arms. Lucas moved to the bed, sitting carefully beside his wife, looking down at the tiny person they'd created. She was perfect, small and wrinkled and covered in vernix, but absolutely perfect. She had Clara's dark hair and what looked like Lucas's nose, and when she opened her eyes and looked up at them with that unfocused newborn gaze, Lucas felt his heart crack open in a way he hadn't known was possible. "Hello, Rose," Clara whispered, touching the baby's impossibly small hand. "We've been waiting for you." Rose wrapped her tiny fingers around Clara's thumb, and Lucas watched his wife fall in love with their daughter in real time. He felt it too, that overwhelming rush of protective love that made everything that had come before, all the pain and fear and fighting, feel worth it. "She's beautiful," Lucas said, his voice rough. "She's ours," Clara said, looking up at him with eyes that shone with joy and exhaustion. "Lucas, we have a daughter." "We have a daughter," Lucas repeated, trying the words out, feeling them settle into his bones like truth. "We have a family." The midwife stayed for a few hours, making sure Clara and the baby were both stable, giving instructions on nursing and recovery. When she finally left, Lucas and Clara were alone with their daughter, just the three of them in the cabin, while the last of the storm clouds cleared and stars began to appear through the window. Lucas sat on the bed with his back against the wall, Clara leaning against his chest, Rose sleeping in Clara's arms. They were exhausted and overwhelmed and completely in love. "I can't believe she's real," Clara said softly. "After everything, after all we went through, I can't believe we get to have this." "We earned it," Lucas said. "Every hard day, every fight, every moment we refused to give up. It was all for this." Clara turned her head to look at him. "Do you think we'll be good parents?" "I think we'll try our best," Lucas said. "And I think that's all anyone can do." Rose stirred in her sleep, making a small sound, and both of them froze. watching her with the focused intensity of new parents who weren't quite sure what they were doing yet. But the baby settled again, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, and Clara relaxed against Lucas with a sigh. "She's going to grow up free," Clara said. "She's never going to know what it's like to be trapped, to be owned, to have to fight for every scrap of dignity and respect. We're going to make sure of that." "Yes," Lucas agreed. "We are." They stayed like that until dawn, watching their daughter sleep, making quiet plans for the future. When the sun finally rose and sent golden light streaming through the east-facing windows Clara had wanted, Lucas carefully got up and opened them wide, letting the morning breeze flow through the room. Clara had been right about the windows. The light was beautiful, warm and clear, filling the space with promise. Lucas looked at his wife and daughter bathed in that golden glow and thought about everything they'd survived to get to this moment. Clara had walked into his life dragging a broken carpet bag and refusing to leave. She'd stood beside him through trials and threats and the constant pressure to give up and run away. She'd been brave when he needed her to be brave, stubborn when he needed her to be stubborn, and steadfast through everything. And now they had this: a daughter, a home, a life they'd built from nothing but determination and love. The land was still hard. The work was still endless. There would be bad seasons and difficult years, struggles Lucas couldn't yet imagine, but they would face those challenges together, the way they'd faced everything else. And they would teach their daughter, and whatever other children might come, to be strong and kind and stubborn enough to fight for what mattered. "Lucas?" Claire's voice drew him from his thoughts. "Yeah?" "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me that first day, for letting me stay when you wanted me to leave, for choosing me." Lucas crossed back to the bed and kissed her forehead, then Rose's. "I didn't choose you," he said. "You chose me. You saw a man who'd built walls around himself and decided those walls weren't going to stop you. You made yourself indispensable before I even realized what was happening." Clara smiled. "Is that a complaint?" "That's the best thing that ever happened to me," Lucas said. "You and Rose, you're everything I didn't know I needed, everything I was too scared to hope for." Rose woke up then, hungry and vocal about it, and the moment of quiet reflection gave way to the practical realities of new parenthood. Clara nursed the baby while Lucas made breakfast, moving through the routine of daily life that had once been solitary and was now shared. Later that day, Lucas carried Rose outside for the first time, showing her the ranch while Clara rested. He walked the property line, pointing out the fence he'd built, the barn where her mother had slept those first nights, the garden that was bursting with the calendula Clara had planted by the door. "This is your home," he told his daughter, who couldn't possibly understand but who looked around with wide, wondering eyes anyway. "Your mother and I built it for you, for us, and nobody's ever going to take it away." Rose made a small sound, maybe agreement, maybe just gas, and Lucas held her closer, marveling at how something so tiny could feel so important. He thought about Richard, about the battles they'd fought, about how close they'd come to losing everything, but Richard was gone now, chased away by Garrett's threats and his own defeat. The trial was over, the civil suit settled, the danger past. They were finally, truly free. Clara appeared in the doorway of the cabin, watching them, and Lucas walked back to join her. She put her arms around both of them, and they stood there as a family, looking out at the land they'd claimed and defended and made their own. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked. Lucas looked at his wife, his brave, impossible, perfect wife, and at the daughter they'd brought into this hard, beautiful world. "I'm thinking this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Clara smiled and kissed him. "Me too." The sun climbed higher, warming the prairie, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, free and wild. Lucas Hale had spent years running from connection, from vulnerability, from the risk of loving someone enough to lose them. But Clara Whitfield had walked into his life with nothing but determination and hope, and she'd refused to leave even when leaving would have been easier. She'd stayed, and in staying, she'd given him everything: a home, a family, a future worth fighting for. The cowboy had laughed when she first arrived, certain she'd be gone by morning. But she hadn't left. She'd worked and waited and worn down his defenses until he couldn't imagine life without her. Now, standing in the doorway of the home they'd built together, holding the daughter they'd created, Lucas understood what Clara had known from the beginning. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay. Sometimes refusing to leave is its own kind of victory. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the person who won't leave your side becomes the reason you stop wanting them to. Clara had been passing through, searching for somewhere to belong. Lucas had been hiding, convinced he was better off alone. And somehow, impossibly, they'd found each other in the vast emptiness of the Wyoming territory and built something that mattered. It wasn't perfect, it would never be easy, but it was theirs, hard-won, and fiercely kept and full of the kind of love that didn't quit just because things got difficult. Rose fell asleep against Lucas's shoulder, her breathing soft and even, completely trusting. Clara leaned her head on Lucas's other shoulder, and together they watched the prairie stretch out before them, golden and endless and full of promise. This was home. This was family. This was everything they'd fought for, everything they'd refused to surrender, everything that made the struggle worth it. And as the morning light caught on the calendula blooming by the door and painted the world in shades of hope, Lucas Hale finally stopped running from happiness and let himself believe in the future his stubborn, beautiful wife had insisted they build together. The cowboy had taken her as a joke. But the joke was on him, because she'd stayed, and in staying she'd given him everything he'd been too afraid to ask for. She'd given him herself. She'd given him Rose. She'd given him a reason to believe that some things, some people, were worth fighting for. And he'd never let them go. Not ever. Not for anything.